I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show where we pit facts against your greatest fears. On today's show, science versus fracking. Is fracking really making us sick and ruining the environment? When we hear stories about fracking, they often go like this. A gas company comes to town, starts drilling wells, and then terrible things start happening. James Hughes says this is exactly what happened to him when the fracking company Seneca Resources came to his town in Pennsylvania.
Seneca shows up at my doorstep and says, "We're drilling wells on your property." It was the biggest nightmare I ever went through. They moved into my property, knocked out my water well.
This is from a town hall meeting held in 2014 when a local township was so freaked out about Seneca's operations that they were deciding whether or not to hire a lawyer to fight them.
They knocked out my water well, knocked out my neighbor's water well, turned the pond pink. By the time they gave me my new water well, it was on fire for 6 months. My family couldn't visit, couldn't have running water, and it broke my heart. So meanwhile, during this time, I composed a song called Chief Thundercloud.
Please, we've got an attorney on the phone. Just tell us, give us the result.
This is what fracking has driven Americans to do.
Gas and oil.
Write more folk songs. Actually, I think this is more prog rock. Just the lack of acoustic guitar.
For what we have done to your land.
But this song, of course, is not peer-reviewed research. And neither is a lot of the conversation happening around fracking.
Fracking is a disaster unfolding across Pennsylvania of unprecedented proportions.
Hydraulic fracturing is spreading across the globe.
Whoa, Jesus Christ.
Unbelievable! A river on fire! Whoa!
The river's on fire! Oh, jeez. The thing is, the anti-frackers love to use hyperbolic statements and half-truths, but they aren't alone. On the other side of this debate, the pro-frackers are pulling their own kind of crap too. And to demonstrate, here's a conversation that I had with fracking company Seneca Resources. This is Doug Kepler, the Vice President of Environmental Engineering, and Rob Boulware, who works in media relations.
I don't believe there has been a problem with fracking. The problems that you hear in the media, those all related back in some fashion to something that had to do with the actual drilling of the well, not the fracking of the well.
But so when we say fracking, as journalists, as the media, and in the public, we mean the entire process of getting gas from underground to your home.
I spend a lot of time trying to correct it because that's an incorrect use.
Am I the problem?
No, seriously, you have created an unbelievably serious problem with this perception thing.
They are answering the question, has there ever been a problem with fracking, to only address the very specific and very technical definition of fracking, cracking the rocks. Not the whole process of fracking, which would include drilling a well, getting the gas out of the well, and all sorts of stuff that most people think of when they think of fracking.
If you want to have a process talk, then you can have a process talk. But when the whole negativity on fracking is what becomes so weird.
No, we want to have a process chat. So the entire process of fracking, has there ever been water contaminated as a result of the entire process of fracking?
You're talking about from drilling
But
through.
see, again, drilling.
To, yes.
So if you're going to say drilling, but not fracking.
Ugh. So that's Seneca Resources, the very same company that inspired Chief Thundercloud.
Whatever happened?
No, there's no need to play that again. Enough with the folk songs. Enough with the Wagner soundtracks and the shady definitions. We're here to look at the science. Today, we're looking at how fracking affects 4 major things: our water, our health, earthquakes, and finally, our climate. Let's start with a detailed look at how fracking actually works. Our frackers, Seneca's Rob Boulware and Doug Kepler, offered to give us an up-close look at one of their fracking sites in northwestern Pennsylvania. The fracking site itself is actually inside a national forest, which means that as you drive in, you see tons of trees and beaver dams, and even Pennsylvania's state bird, the ruffled grouse.
Oh, look, Doug. You see it, Doug? It's a grouse, isn't it? Right back there. See it?
Oh, I see him on the edge of the road there.
But as you approach the frack, things look a little different. We see a couple of huge cranes connected to a bundle of narrow pipes. And it's right here that water gets pushed under the surface at intense pressures, which is what cracks the rock to release the natural gas.
We're actually fracking right now underground. So there is a 5-inch diameter pipe that water is being pumped through. We're pumping about 4,000 gallons per minute of water through that pipe. So a tremendous amount of water in a very quick time. The pressure from that is what breaks the rock.
Gimlet producer Caitlin Kenny is here with me.
Right under our feet right now, big old rocks are breaking.
Yes, and
I can't feel anything.
But it's not just water going down that pipe. There's also sand and chemicals.
there's a conveyor belt that takes all the sand to the blender where the water in those tanks is blended along with the chemicals, and then they're pumped down hole.
The sand is used to keep the cracks in the rocks open so that the gas can flow out, while the chemicals, they do a couple of things. A bactericide is added to prevent bacteria growing down the hole, and to get the fracking fluid moving very quickly through a very narrow pipe, they add friction reducers. And this brings us to the first fear that people have about fracking. Can these chemicals get into our drinking water? When rocks are being cracked more than a mile underground, which is below drinking water supplies, studies have shown that there is a very low risk of the fracking chemicals seeping up through the rocks, up into your drinking water. It could happen, but one study estimated that it would take several thousand or even millions of years. And the thing is, one report estimated that 95% of fracking wells in America are being fracked this far below the surface. In Australia, though, where fracking is happening higher up, it is riskier. So, that's cracks in rocks. But there is also the potential of chemicals leaking into our water through cracks in pipes. But how often does that happen? Well, a study found that in Pennsylvania, 6% of pipes had some kind of problem. So it's not widespread, but it is happening. So that's what's happening below ground. But the biggest risk of contamination, it seems, is happening above ground, on the surface.
Here, what am I looking at here?
Doug from Seneca explains that once you've cracked the rocks open to release the natural gas, the gas comes up and the pressure from the gas carries the fracking water back up with it.
So you had shoved the water down there.
We pump it down under pressure to fracture the rock, and then the pressure of the gas carries the water back up out of the ground with the gas, and then we separate the gas from the water.
And this water, which has the fracking chemicals in it, plus salts and heavy metals from underground, is now known as wastewater. Anyway, you've got all this wastewater that's up at the surface, and it gets trucked or piped away from the fracking site, and then Seneca has to figure out what to do with it. Right now, they're storing some of it, and they showed us the storage site. It looked like 3 giant water coolers.
So this is how many gallons?
Each one of those 3 tanks holds 2 million gallons of water.
That is a load of water.
It is a lot of water.
When you look at the entire fracking industry, it's billions of gallons of wastewater per year. And while the shiny tanks that we saw looked watertight, not all fracking sites are storing their wastewater this way. Sometimes fracking companies use pits, large holes that they've dug in the ground and then lined with a plastic. Now, this plastic is thick, but still it can rip, allowing wastewater to leak. Also, when you're schlepping vats of wastewater plus vats of fracking chemicals around, there's just lots of chances for spills. But here's the question, and it's a really important question. Yes, there's lots of chances for leaks and spills, but how often do they actually happen? It's time to talk to our expert.
The bullfrog.
This is Robert Jackson, a professor at Stanford, and he's one of the top experts on fracking in America. He also does some very impressive frog poetry. This is the green tree frog.
Oinky boink boink.
So remember when I said at the beginning of the show that both sides of this debate weren't being straight with the fracts? Well, That can make it hard to know who to trust on this fracking debate. But Robert Jackson, he's my guy. I do trust what he says. And it's not because of the frog poetry. Well, it's partly because of the frog poetry. But it's also because of this.
Honestly, I get beat up from everybody depending on what a particular study says. When we publish a study that says we find no evidence of contamination of drinking water in a place like the Fayetteville Field, I get calls and emails from people saying, how can you say that? And you only looked at 100 or 150 houses and this and this and that. And I promise you, every time I say that we find water contamination or I publish a map of 6,000 leaks in Washington, D.C., I get beat up from people in industry who say you're fear-mongering, you're promoting the decline of our industry and all that. I get it from all sides.
So, leading researcher in the field pisses off both sides of this debate. What does he say about how often fracking contaminates water?
It does contaminate drinking water. It has contaminated drinking water, but most of the time it doesn't. So it can happen. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens to you or your neighborhood, or you think it could happen to you, it's something to be afraid of. And I think that's what people latch onto. So most of the time it's completely safe. Once in a while it isn't.
It's really hard for scientists to put a figure on what that once in a while is. A report made public by the Environmental Protection Agency last year put the number at between 100 to 3,700 spills from fracking each year in the United States. Let's think about that for a second. The EPA doesn't know if there are 100 or 3,700 spills. We're going to put a sound effect on that, right? Cool. From fracking each year. Why so much uncertainty? Well, there's a few reasons. But one of them is that if scientists go to a town and test the water and find out that it's dodgy, if no one tested that water before the frackers came to town, then the scientists can't say for sure what made it dodgy. Some things are just naturally in the water. They come from the rocks and the geology nearby. And currently, we don't have a lot of this independently gathered baseline data. Add to this, it's notoriously difficult to get fracking companies to acknowledge spills and to explain what happened. Seneca does this too. Take, for example, when we asked Doug from Seneca about whether fracking chemicals had ever contaminated water. He and Rob denied it.
That hasn't, I don't think we could find a documented case of that.
But we could. We used the internet and found that there were 270 instances where an oil and gas company had affected someone's water supply in Pennsylvania. In each of those cases, the Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, sent a letter confirming the contamination to the company that was responsible, and Seneca was called out in a handful of those letters. When we talked to Seneca about this, they kept denying that their chemicals were responsible for contaminating people's water. And that's when we finally took out the letters.
Okay, so like this. Have you guys seen these letters from the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania? This is to Seneca, and this.
Now, for a visual on what you're about to hear, this was happening in Rob's car right outside the fracking site. The conversation went on for a while, and by the time I took the letters out of my backpack, it was actually so tense that the windows had steamed up, Titanic style.
So just the fact that you have one of these letters doesn't mean we actually polluted something. It means that they're responding to a complaint that was made.
I think this says that it is determined that there was a pollution, a contamination caused.
Let me see what's this one. This is again Warsaw Township, Jefferson County, 2009. Increased levels of sodium chlorides and total dissolved solids. This looks like there was some type of impact at that time because the sodium would have come from the drilling itself. But I don't remember what it was, but it appears there was a temporary impact on this one. But again, I wasn't looking at the types of things we're doing now, what you're talking about.
But that is included. When you read the EPA report on hydraulic fracturing and the effects of it, we are talking about from the surface spills. We're talking about exactly where something might go wrong. And you even mentioned
I stand firm on what we've done at Seneca, that we have not had those issues.
But And you read the letter and it
No, because this is not fracking. That's what I'm saying.
It wasn't, and it didn't have the process of fracking within it.
We fracked as well, but this was not anything that had to do with fracking. It looks to me as though with that it would have probably been some type of surface spill next to was it a spring again? Yeah, it was a spring on that.
And why was there spills into people's water supply?
Why did it happen?
And they were related to surface
Yeah,
spills.
it was a very careless act by a contractor on the location that spilled that one that temporarily impacted that spring. So yes, it did happen. I'm not making light of it. It wasn't willful. It was an accident. But this was one incident that happened that year out of 300 and some wells that were drilled, and it didn't happen every year. But I would say we probably averaged maybe one or so, some years maybe two, some years maybe not, but maybe one a year, something like this would happen with a 300 well program when the regulations were very lax compared to what they are now.
So that's what it takes to get these guys to agree to publicly confirmed facts that you can find on the internet. Now, about those regulations Doug mentioned at the end, we're not going to go into the details of how regulations on fracking have changed in different parts of America or the world. But regulations on fracking continue to get tighter. And looking around us today at Seneca's storage site and the fracking site, you can see the effects of them. Here at the site, there was lining under everything. Those water coolers that were filled with waste, they were sitting on what looked like a giant kid's swimming pool made out of metal. And then under that was another layer of protection.
You have to have containment in case a tank would have some type of failure.
And all of this was designed to stop a leak if, say, something busted out of one of those water containers. Conclusion. Chemicals used in fracking can contaminate drinking water. They leak through damaged pipes or spills up on the surface. But from what we know, these instances are rare. Okay, so the scary stuff used in fracking doesn't get into drinking water very often. But when it does, will it make you sick? After the break, I drink some fracking chemicals and we find out. No, I'm definitely not going to do that. But we will talk to scientists about the potential health risks.
This episode is brought to you by Capital One. With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts, is it even a decision? Get started today. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account with Capital One, and there's no minimum to open and keep your account. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One N.A. Member FDIC.
I'm Yasi Salek, and I'm the host of Bandsplain, a show where we explain cult bands and iconic artists by going deep into their histories and discographies. We're back with a brand new season at our brand new home, the Ringer Podcast Network, tackling a whole new batch of artists, from grunge gods to power pop pioneers to nu metal legends, and many, many more. Listen to new episodes every Thursday, only on Spotify.
Welcome back to Science Versus. So, we talked about how fracking chemicals can get into your water, and we're going to get to the environmental impacts of fracking just a bit later. But let's start where we left off. The scary stuff in fracking can get into drinking water. But if that happens, will it make you sick? Some of you listening have seen scary footage of people lighting their water on fire, and they say fracking is to blame. Footage like this.
Unbelievable! A river on fire!
In this video, an Australian politician fashioned after Steve Irwin lights a match and puts it to a river, and flames leap up from the water. It's all very dramatic.
Whoa! The fracking just a kilometre away, methane coming up, and now the river is alight.
This video is real, and the water is burning because methane, the main ingredient in natural gas, is flammable. And it can end up in water supplies because when you're fracking and trying to capture all that natural gas underground, some of it leaks through the pipes and can escape. But just because something is flammable, it doesn't mean it's bad for you. Pistachio nuts are flammable. Fun fact, right? Oh, the pistachio nuts are on fire. Anyway, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, quote, Drinking water or eating food prepared with water containing methane gas is not a health hazard, end quote. The CDC also says that methane leaves the water and enters the air very quickly. So even if there was a lot of methane, quote, it is unlikely that this level would remain in the water long enough to be ingested, end quote. So that's methane. What about the chemicals used in fracking operations? We talked about a few of them already. The bactericide, the friction reducers. Are they okay to drink? Well, no. An Australian team of researchers recently bathed some cells from the human intestine in the water and chemical mix used in fracking. And it killed the cells. The mix was toxic. But you would never drink this mix straight. If fracking water was coming out of your tap, it would be cut with lots and lots of fresh water. And as a general rule, the more diluted things get, the safer they get. So, when this same team of Australian researchers diluted the fracking mix by 5 times, the test couldn't pick up any damage to the cells. And the researchers pointed out that the water coming out of your tap would actually be way more diluted than that. But they wrote in their paper that if you were exposed chronically over time to the diluted chemicals in fracking, it might change the game. Plus, cells in a petri dish versus the body, that's very different. So to get to the bottom of these health questions, we need to look at another kind of study. Say, a survey of people living near fracking wells. Peter Rabinowitz, a physician and an associate professor at the University of Washington, has done just that. He started studying fracking after a visit to southwestern Pennsylvania when he spoke to one family that claimed to have been affected by fracking operations nearby. The family told Peter that the drilling company had said that the water was fine.
And it certainly didn't look that way to me, and they definitely said that it had changed in some way. And then they gave interesting anecdotes that I was not sure what to make of, about how when they tried to give water to their dog, the dog refused to drink from the bowl, or another dog drank some of the water and got sick and its hair fell out.
It's a scary story. Dodgy fracking company, dog's hair falling out. Peter was intrigued. But he's a scientist, and this was an anecdote. So he got a team together, and they surveyed the health of 180 households in the area. Ultimately, he found no link between living near a fracking site and the people reporting that they had heart, brain, or stomach problems. But he did find something. 2 issues were more likely to be reported in those living within 1 kilometre of a fracking drill compared to those living further away. 1. Skin problems.
Which included generalized rashes or itching of the skin.
And 2. Upper respiratory complaints.
Which could be burning eyes or cough or sore throats.
But Peter says just because he found those issues, that doesn't mean the chemicals in fracking or fracking operations caused them. It's a correlation at this point, which means that there is a very real risk that these issues could be caused by something else, the nocebo effect. This is like the placebo effect's evil twin sister, where just believing that something will make you sick actually does. And so powerful is the nocebo and the placebo effect that every medical study has to consider them. And according to Peter, the circumstances surrounding fracking are a perfect storm for this kind of thing.
Things have happened so rapidly that there's a lack of information flowing. I think it's more likely that people start fearing the worst and thinking that there could be unknown hazards that they, again, are being exposed to.
So it could be that people's fears about fracking are making them anxious and stressed and bringing on those rashes. But it could also be the fracking chemicals. So with this in mind, Peter also asked residents about the health of their farm animals and their pets. Because while your dog might be very smart,
we don't expect that they're going to read the newspaper or listen to the radio and have preconceptions about whether they're sick or not.
He looked at a range of domestic animals, dogs, cats, fish, someone even had a pet raccoon. Who has a pet raccoon? Pocahontas had a pet raccoon.
Come on, Miko.
Overall, good news for Miko. He found that pets living near fracking wells weren't any sicker than animals living further away. But when he analysed the results focusing on the dogs, he found that they were more likely to have skin problems if they lived closer to the fracking wells. Peter wanted to know more, so a year after his survey, he returned to the households to get more data.
We asked someone in the household to provide a urine specimen and also to get a urine specimen from a dog in the house.
Just in general, you knock on someone's door and say, "Remember me from a year ago, can I get some urine?"
It's an interesting conversation to have, and some people say yes and some people say no, and then when you ask to get a sample from the dog, it gets even more interesting. They're not used to doing that.
Peter is currently looking into this data. So where does that leave us? What is the scientific answer? Are chemicals from fracking making us sick?
There may be something here, and we need to have further, better studies to investigate it further.
Conclusion. If there was a major chemical spill onto your property's water and the water looked different, it's probably not a good idea to drink it because high doses of fracking fluid are likely to be toxic. But in terms of whether you'll get sick from smaller, say harder to detect leaks, currently there's not good evidence that you will. Next up on our journey into fears about fracking, we're moving away from the personal and asking, what is fracking doing to the world around us? Like, is it causing earthquakes? Some parts of the US, including Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, have experienced... Oh, sorry, I'm going to get letters about that. Should have been Colorado. Okay, so some parts of the US, including Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, have experienced an unprecedented increase in earthquakes since 2009. And unprecedented, that's not my word. It comes from a paper published in Science magazine. And Professor Robert Jackson, he says these earthquakes are worth getting shook up about. Obviously, he didn't use those words. He doesn't talk in puns.
It gets people's attention when someone has to start paying for earthquake insurance when they didn't even know what an earthquake was probably a decade ago. I mean, that is really remarkable, and that is not natural.
Yes, Robert says frackers are responsible for the increase in earthquakes, but not for the reason that you might think. I'll let Robert explain.
Oinky boink.
Whoa, wrong audio.
It's not this step of cracking open the rock that's causing those earthquakes. That does cause little tiny tremors, but no one feels those. What's causing some of these earthquakes instead is the disposal of the wastewater.
Okay, so wastewater. Remember, that's the dirty water that comes back up the pipe after you frack the rocks. Now, you can deal with that water in a couple of different ways. You can store it above ground in those giant water coolers. You can recycle it, use it for more fracking. But it's just a lot of water to deal with. So sometimes the fracking companies just shove it right back underground into what's called a deep injection well. And those wells are the problem.
What's causing some of these earthquakes is the disposal of the wastewater. When we pump millions of gallons of wastewater back underground at high pressure, it can cause rock layers to slip. It essentially lubricates those rock layers, and that slipping is an earthquake.
So, pouring wastewater from fracking down an underground disposal well can and is causing earthquakes in some places. Huh, that was an easy one. But here's a tricky one. How is fracking impacting climate change? The sweet fuel we get from fracking, natural gas, is in one way great for the climate. It doesn't emit much carbon dioxide when it's burnt. But the main ingredient of natural gas, methane, is not that great for the climate. It's a greenhouse gas, and it traps heat very effectively, more effectively than carbon dioxide.
Natural gas is mostly methane, and methane's an incredibly potent greenhouse gas.
This is Bob Howarth, and he's an ecology professor at Cornell University. Bob says that when fracking companies are trying to capture the natural gas, some of it escapes, becoming what's known as fugitive methane. No, seriously, that's the scientific term for it. Fugitive methane. Like the fugitive. The one-armed man, but for methane. Do-do-do-do. Do-do-do.
It's a really bad whammy for the climate. Even very small emissions of methane to the atmosphere are globally important in terms of global warming.
Fugitive methane is obviously problematic. But the question is, how much methane is actually leaking into the atmosphere from fracking? And this question, just like the question of how much fracking chemicals are getting into people's water, is really tricky to answer. For one, the science is pretty new. Bob published the first paper to look at this, and it wasn't that long ago, in 2011. And back then, his calculations made the picture look bad for fracking. But that was just one paper. So Bob went searching for more data. He got in a plane, hunting for plumes of fugitive methane. Do-do-do-do, do-do-do.
We used an airplane and we flew over southwestern Pennsylvania in the Marcellus Shale area. The pilot flew back and forth measuring methane in real time. And he was able to determine plumes, they're clearly visible when you plot the data out, that are coming from distinct points on the ground.
Using the data that Bob collected, along with other work, he estimates that in parts of America, around 9% of the methane that companies are trying to capture escapes during the entire fracking process. But lots of folks cite lower numbers than Bob's. And much of this is because fugitive methane emissions fluctuate wildly, depending on a lot of factors, like the type of rocks in an area. Either way, whatever the number is, it isn't very helpful in isolation. The important question for us right now is this. Is natural gas production, which obviously includes fracking, better for the climate than our other big fuel source, coal? If Bob's fugitive methane estimates are correct, then no, natural gas is worse than coal. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which represents the views of over 800 scientists from 80 countries, disagrees. Every few years, these scientists analyse the most up-to-date research on, among other things, how energy production is affecting climate change. And at their last report, they labelled natural gas, the fuel from fracking, as a transition fuel. That is something that's better than coal. But over the years, as more and more data has been coming out on fugitive methane emissions, the IPCC has been giving less and less love to natural gas. So after reading the IPCC reports and chatting to Bob, I didn't know what to think. I talked to Robert Jackson at Stanford. This has been exploding my brain a little bit because you have even the IPCC, over time, I feel like they've been moving on this as well and saying, oh, we didn't realize the methane leaks were bad. Natural gas is worse than we thought. But where do you think we're currently sitting on this methane leakage question when it comes to fracking?
Our work, the work of many people, has shown quite clearly that we've been underestimating the leaks on average, not everywhere, but on average. That doesn't mean that number, that leakage is so large that it's, that it negates any potential benefits compared to coal, or that it's far worse than coal. I just don't think the body of evidence suggests that to be the case.
So, bottom line, to the question of natural gas versus coal?
Point blank, I think natural gas is a better fuel than coal. Anytime we can take an old coal plant offline, I'm all for it.
But of course, that's just compared to coal. Don't go buying your I Heart Fracking t-shirts just yet. Practically everyone we spoke to agreed that renewables are the best option for reducing pollution and staving off climate change. Conclusion. Methane from natural gas does escape into the atmosphere through fracking, and that's bad for the climate. It traps heat. It's a powerful greenhouse gas. But currently, the evidence suggests that even with that, natural gas is better than coal, but worse than renewables. So, our fears about fracking, do they stack up? Maybe? Not really? Let's break it down. Fear number 1, can the chemicals from fracking contaminate people's water? Science says... Yes, but these instances are rare. Fear number 2, can these chemicals make us sick? Science says... Yes, in high doses. but the amount that's likely to get into your water supply is small. And so far, and for now, the evidence suggests that in these doses, people should be okay. Fear number 3. Does fracking cause earthquakes? Science says, here, there's almost no debate. Fracking sites that dispose of their wastewater by injecting it back into the ground, they can cause earthquakes. And fear number 4, will fracking destroy the climate? Science says, well, it's not good for the climate. It's better than coal. It's worse than renewables. So, when you add all these points up, how bad is fracking? It's not an unmitigated evil. The science on many of these fears is uncertain. And that means that when anyone comes out with some grand statement about the horrors of fracking or the greatness of fracking, those comments aren't based on science. But they do make for a good story. Remember Chief Thundercloud? James Hughes?
Whatever happened to Chief Thundercloud? Where are his people? Where is the land of the free?
We called him to find out exactly what happened. And yeah, he told us a good story.
Well, it happened so fast, Wendy. I didn't expect it, and boom, boom, boom. I mean, they just basically, they started drilling next door, right, first, to my neighbor's ground. Next thing you know, boom, I had red water coming out of my faucet, and I went, what in the world's going on?
And yes, we checked it out. We contacted Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, who confirmed that James's water did change colour. The DEP said in their report that by releasing iron from the rocks, the drilling process had turned the pond a reddish-brown colour. And according to James, that was just the beginning.
So, wow. Seneca, they drilled me a new water well. And when they were putting the new plumbing in, somebody lit up a match for a cigarette. Poof! We had almost like an explosion.
The DEP report doesn't mention the fire, but it does mention that the new water well initially had high levels of methane, which returned to normal after some months. Seneca's Rob Boulware told us, quote, in this instance, a new water well was drilled for Mr. Hughes, and the minor methane issue was addressed via installation of venting on the water well, end quote. He also said that Seneca accepted the DEP's resolution, but, quote, Mr. Hughes was not fully satisfied with that result. End quote.
That's why I don't like these guys, Wendy. These guys drill holes in the ground, puke up the land, ruin water, have a bad attitude. Then us poor landowners got to go, what just happened to us? Well, I'm one of these guys. I'm what you call a fighter. I don't like people stomping on me. I'm a Donald Trump kind of guy.
Oh, boy.
The whole thing ended up in a legal battle, and they settled out of court. So, compelling story, right? But remember the science? These events are rare. And the thing is, the scary stories, they get the headlines and they capture our imagination. But the science, it isn't that easy. It's complicated and slow and full of inconvenient details. And I know that's hard if you're at the pub and you're trying to have very strong opinions, but that's the way it is. And the thing is, if you do want an easy answer, I've got one YouTube video for you.
Unbelievable! A river on fire! Don't let it burn the boat! Whoa!
That's Science versus Fracking. This episode has been produced by Caitlin Kenny, Heather Rogers, Caitlin Sori, edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Alex Bloomberg. Production assistance by Austin Mitchell and fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Recordings from the town hall meeting in 2014 are from NPR's WHYY reporter, Katie Colineri, and the team at NPR's State Impact Pennsylvania. Thank you. A big thanks to the Gimlet Hive Mind for comments and joke advisements. That's you, Eric Mennel, PJ Boat, and Stevie Lane, plus the Zuckerman family. Thank you. Sound design and music production by Matthew Bolt. Music written by Bobby Lord. Next time, attachment parenting. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show where we pit facts against feelings. On today's show, science versus attachment parenting. And even if you're not a parent, stick around, because we'll tell you just how much you can blame your parents for screwing you up.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Are those the Three Little Pigs houses, or is that New York City?
New York City.
Look how tall those buildings are. Wow.
It's taller than the sky.
This is Mum Judy playing with her kids, 3-year-old Isabel and 1-year-old Robert. The cramped one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan where she lives with her kids and her husband is packed with toys and children's books. It's unmistakably a kid-centered home, and that's exactly the type of parent that Judy is. Kid-centered. She is an attachment parent, which means that she practices a style of parenting that says you should keep your baby close at all times, you should breastfeed your baby, sleep in the same bed as your infant, and no strollers allowed.
I just feel as though a stroller, when they're so small, it doesn't feel right. It just makes me cry to think like they're separated from me and they're all by themselves with blankets as a surrogate. You know, it just doesn't feel right. In the first few months, it's like the 4th trimester, and they should just be part of me.
Judy didn't want us to use her last name because she's talking about her kids and she wants to protect their privacy. But she is an attachment parent because she believes that all of the sacrifices she makes to raise her kids this way will make them better adults.
I'm a believer. I'm living the dream.
And she didn't get this idea of attachment parenting on her own. There are scores of books and websites devoted to promoting this style of parenting. And the king of it all is William Sears. He popularized the term attachment parenting, and according to Sears, attachment parenting leads to a baby who's, quote, more trusting, feels more competent, grows better, feels right, acts right, is better organized, learns language more easily, establishes healthy independence, learns intimacy, and learns to give and receive love. William Sears declined our numerous requests for an interview, but here he is on American talk show The View.
You know, I've been doing this for 40 years.
Yeah.
The healthiest babies in the world I have seen. Those who never become school bullies. Those who radiate like a sunflower turning toward a
the
face.
Lord's children.
They are the attachment parented babies.
I have to say this to you because there is a...
William Sears' seminal book on attachment parenting, The Baby Book, which he co-wrote with his wife Martha, has sold over 1.5 million copies. Even more convincing, though, Angelina Jolie, Kourtney Kardashian, and Gisele Bündchen all practiced attachment parenting, according to the Gossip Mags. Perhaps less convincingly, Blossom is a big fan.
Don't know about the future, that's anybody's guess. Ain't no good reason for getting all depressed.
The thing is, though, attachment parenting has been criticised for being absurdly demanding on parents. So, is all the work worth it? Can attachment parenting really do what it promises? When it comes to raising your kids, everyone has an opinion. But then, there's science. Okay, so before we take on attachment parenting and all its rules, let's start by explaining where all this stuff came from, because it does have scientific roots. That is, attachment is a term borrowed from science. And attachment in the scientific community means something in particular. It's something you can test for. Alan Schroef is a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Minnesota, and he has spent his career researching attachment and what makes a child securely attached. He's one of the foremost experts on the topic.
Attachment refers to a relationship between an infant and a particular adult. What we mean by secure attachment is that the child is confident about the availability and responsiveness of this particular adult. So they're secure in that relationship. They feel safe within it.
And according to Alan, you can do a test to see whether this attachment exists. The test has a kind of funny name. It's called the Strange Situation Procedure. Alan has done these tests for years, and the sound you're about to hear is from one of his studies. So, in broad strokes, here's how the test works. A parent and a baby are in a room together. After a few minutes, a stranger enters the room and the parent leaves. Then the stranger leaves and the parent re-enters. The researchers watch the reunion of parent and child, focusing on the kid's reaction. A child who is happy when the parent returns is considered securely attached. A child who continues crying and is upset when the parent returns, or is kind of unresponsive, is considered insecurely attached. There's more to it, but that's the main idea. Now, it's not a perfect test. It's very hard to measure how much confidence a toddler has in her parent. But for those who study attachment, this test is kind of the best they've got. And Alan, he believes in it.
The reason it's so good is that it kind of summarizes everything that went on. It's like the integrative summary of all the experiences that came the infant's way.
For over 3 decades, Alan and his team have followed more than 200 people from birth to adulthood, looking for differences in securely attached and insecurely attached kids. He and the team interviewed the kids as they got older. They even set up schools and summer camps to observe the kids interacting with their peers. And Alan says from the early days of the study, he could see the benefits of being a securely attached kid. So, for example, when all the children were 3 years old, he gave them a little problem-solving task. It was pulling a lever to get a toy. Now, this is the same kid that you just heard in the strange situation procedure, but now she's 3 years old. Missy!
Show them. Show me how.
Those children who had histories of secure attachment were more self-confident, worked harder on the problems, were more persistent, were more agentic, meaning that they portrayed an inner belief that if they worked hard, they could solve the problem.
Alan's study also looked at what happened if kids didn't securely attach, and he found that insecurely attached kids were more likely to have lower self-esteem, harbour feelings of rejection, and have poorer relationships later in life. So, the professor tells us that having a securely attached baby is a good thing. But, and this is the question that we'll be investigating, does attachment parenting, the thing that William Sears popularised, actually lead to what Alan Shrove is testing for, secure attachment? Do the rules outlined in William Sears' baby book and in hundreds of other articles and websites and books actually ensure secure attachment? We're going to focus on 4 of these rules, ones that you see again and again and again. Rule number 1, breastfeed. A lot. Rule number 2, don't let your baby cry, especially at bedtime.
3.
Rule number 3, share your bed with your baby.
4.
And rule number 4, wear your baby. Let's start with rule number 1, breastfeed. Attachment parenter, Judy, believed in this so much that she went to great lengths to get the job done.
I did every possible thing to breastfeed and to make enough milk and to make it seem like I was breastfeeding with a tube on my, on my breast.
A tube. Judy wasn't making enough milk to rely on. She produced some, but not enough for the baby to live on. And so she needed to use formula. But she didn't want her baby to lose out on the entire breastfeeding experience. So she didn't just use a regular baby bottle. Instead, she attached a tube to the bottle and held it right near her nipple. That way, she figured, the baby would think she was nursing.
And you figure out a way to just hold it there with the bottle, with the baby, and I was so determined.
All this determination to give her kids the somewhat authentic experience of breastfeeding. Was it worth it? When we consider whether breastfeeding is really better for your kid, there are 2 parts to this. There's the right boob and the left boob. Joking, although it's true, right? Anyway, there's the milk and there's the act of breastfeeding. Let's start with the milk. Breast milk is sure good for the baby's health. A According to the World Health Organization, breast milk protects against infectious and chronic diseases, and in the long term, being breastfed has been linked to having lower blood pressure and a reduced risk of obesity. But what about the act of breastfeeding? Is that critical to attachment? Well, a Dutch team followed over 600 mothers and their babies and looked at how breastfeeding affected attachment. In 2012, they published their results, finding that breastfeeding had no impact on whether the kids were defined as securely attached or not. That is, based on the strange situation procedure. Want more evidence? A 2008 paper, which scrutinised a bunch of studies on this, came to the same conclusion. Quote, assumptions on a positive role of breastfeeding on the mother-infant relationship are not supported by empirical evidence. End quote. Conclusion. Breastfeeding is good for a bunch of reasons. Secure attachment isn't one of them. So, on to rule number 2. Whenever your baby cries, leap into action. Attachment parents can take a zero-tolerance approach to crying. And it's not that babies aren't allowed to cry, it's just that parents should hop to as soon as the tears start, if not before.
They give me a little squeak or a little tiny cry. They don't even have to cry. They just know I'm gonna come. And I like that. If I take a shower, I can hear the baby crying from the other room, even if the shower's on. Even if someone else is out there, if they don't pick them up, I can hear. The baby needs something and I have to help figure out what it is.
And the subject of how much crying is okay often comes up when you're talking about sleep training. So sleep training is teaching a baby to sleep through the night. And a key part of this involves letting your baby cry a bit without responding too much. The idea is that she'll learn how to put herself back to sleep. But attachment parenting proponents warn that letting babies cry could potentially have severe long-term detrimental psychological effects. On William Sears' website, he says, quote, baby loses trust in the signal value of his cry, and perhaps baby also loses trust in the responsiveness of his caregivers. Not only does something vital go out of baby, an important ingredient in the parent-child relationship goes out of parents. Sensitivity. End quote. Sears sums up the whole idea with the line, quote, we train pets, we parent children. End quote. But according to Jane Fisher, a professor of clinical psychology at Monash University in Melbourne, this is just wrong.
I think it's a false assertion to suggest that this is the only way in which sensitive responsive care can be provided.
Jane specialises in parenting and early childhood development, and along with conducting peer-reviewed research, she works in a special facility in Australia for parents and babies. It's called a residential early parenting service, and it's a place where new parents can go to get counselling and support.
We admit nearly 1,000 women a year, and I've been actively involved in clinical work there for 20 years. So I've been involved in the care of 12 to 15,000 mothers and babies. Women arrive at our service usually absolutely exhausted with low mood and high anxiety and very unsettled babies. Often what we learn as we have conversations with them is that any time the baby makes a sound, they pick the baby up, they hold the baby near them, they take the baby with them wherever they go, day or night. What this leads to is a very unpredictable pattern of care.
Jane's an advocate for sleep training, and she says the psychological damage that attachment parents fear isn't real. She points to several studies, including one from this year, which looked at toddlers 12 months after they'd been sleep trained. The study found no differences in emotional or behavioural well-being, and no differences in secure attachment between the babies who'd been sleep trained and those who hadn't. And Jane Fisher says that the benefits of sleep training go beyond the kids. Sleep training is good for mums and dads too.
So after a couple of days of care like this, the amount of crying and fussing diminishes dramatically, feeding improves, overall amount of sleep increases. And we can see that as that happens, a mother's confidence grows, her anxiety diminishes, and her spirits lift. And I've seen this now more than 10,000 times, and it is a very powerful thing to observe.
Jane says that even though she knows the research about sleep training and she knows that it isn't bad for babies, she gets why it's really hard for mums like Judy to sleep train, to let their babies cry a bit in service of them sleeping through the night. Jane's a mum too. Now, you've got 4 kids. Do you remember trying to put your first one to sleep, or your second, or your third?
And I was extremely dumb. So with my first baby, I continued to suckle her overnight for far too long. And finally, when she was about 18 months old, a book came out called Toddler Taming. And we read the book, and I thought, I can't possibly do this, but my husband was more robust and he said, we're going to do it. So for 2 nights, I didn't get up. He soothed and settled her in bed, and it stopped. The overnight waking stopped.
And why did you, when you read the book, why did you think there's no way I can do this?
Oh, I think because it was so difficult to feel that I was withholding care she needed. But in fact, what I now realise is it wasn't withholding care. She had lots of loving care. It was trying to actually help her into a developmentally appropriate state where she could sleep in her own bed all night.
Conclusion. According to the best science available, sleep training or letting your baby cry a bit will not damage them or your relationship with them. But it does mean, parents, you might just get some sleep. Coming up after the break, should parents sleep in the same bed as their baby? Plus, the man who sold 1.5 million books on attachment parenting sends us his evidence.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from The Ringer, and this is a podcast called The Rewatchables. We have been doing it really since 2017. It started with how much we love the movie Heat. We decided to structure a whole podcast with categories: most rewatchable scene, who won the movie, Apex Mountain, what age the best. But here's the thing. If you want the full archive, you can hear them only on Spotify, for free, by the way. So make sure to follow The Rewatchables on Spotify.
Welcome back to Science versus Attachment Parenting. So, time for attachment parenting rule number 3. Sleep with your baby. Judy's daughter Isabel slept with her parents until she was around 15 months old. Judy wanted her son, Robert, to sleep in the bed with her and her husband as well, but Robert was too restless, so she keeps him as close as possible.
But it kind of doesn't matter. We're kind of swirling around all night, like everybody's facing different directions.
I love you forever.
Science Versus producer Heather Rogers talked with Judy and her family at their home in Manhattan.
When you sleep, Isabel, where do you sleep?
In my bed.
So when
Baby sleeps inside too.
So when everyone's asleep in the same room?
Yes.
Is it nice to wake up and your parents are there?
Mommy.
That's a no comment. She's only known that her whole life, so she doesn't know any other way.
It's a sweet scene, and according to William Sears, it's more than that. In the baby book, he says that if you don't sleep with your baby, you risk breaking, quote, fragile connections with your baby, end quote. We asked William Sears for the research that supports that claim and others that he and his wife make about attachment parenting. We heard back from his communications officer, his son, Matt Sears. He sent us an email that read, quote, a lot of Dr. Bill's writings are based primarily on his own experience raising 8 children and 40 plus years as a paediatrician, end quote. Matt did include links for 2 academic papers on sleeping in the same bed as babies. But neither paper, one from 2010 and the other from 2012, endorsed this practice. And neither paper said anything at all about attachment. And I guess that makes sense since their author is an anthropologist and not a medical scientist or a developmental psychologist. But Professor Jane Fisher is a psychologist, and she gets frustrated by people making grand claims about the supposed benefits of sleeping in the same bed as your baby. Well, as frustrated as an Australian version of Mrs. Potts can sound. into the cupboard with you all?
I don't think it's accurate to say that if a mother and her baby are not sharing a sleep space, that this responsive care in which a baby's needs are responded to, I don't think that sharing a space is essential for that.
But for Jane Fisher, it actually goes beyond frustration and into professional duty. She says that when it comes to sleeping in the same bed as your baby,
it's been shown quite clearly that constitutes a risk to that child's survival. So it is no longer permissible in Australia for us to encourage, permit, condone, give any professional endorsement to a baby sharing a bed space with an adult.
the risk that she's talking about is babies dying from sudden, unexpected infant deaths. And in the US, 3,500 babies died this way in 2014. Now, we don't know why these babies die, but we do know that the risk of sudden infant death jumps when babies share a bed with their parents. Attachment parenting websites and books often downplay this danger. They argue that infants are only at risk when mothers smoke, drink, or take up drugs. Now, while these factors actually can increase the risk of death, a 2012 paper found a baby is still at risk, even if these things aren't happening. It found that for babies under 3 months, there is a 5-fold increase in the risk of these kinds of deaths when infants share a bed with, quote, non-smoking parents and the mother who has not taken alcohol or drugs, end quote. Conclusion. There is no evidence that sleeping in the same bed as your baby will help that baby attach, and there is a small but very real risk of sudden unexpected infant death. Okay, so far, the data to back up these rules of attachment parenting are looking pretty thin. So what about rule number 4? Carry your baby on your body. In the baby book, Sears writes, quote, "Good things happen to carried babies and their parents. Most noticeably, carried babies cry less, as if they forget to fuss. Besides being happier, carried babies develop better, possibly because the energy they would have wasted on crying is diverted into growth." End quote. Also in the baby book, Sears refer to research they conducted on baby wearing. They write that while attending an international parenting conference, they noticed mothers from other cultures holding their babies in sling-like carriers. They were particularly struck by 2 such women from Zambia. Quote, "Women in their culture don't have the benefits of books and studies about mothering hormones. What they have is centuries of tradition that have simply taught them that something good happens to women and their babies when babies are worn." End quote. But according to the experts we did talk to, there is no evidence that carrying a baby will help your kid to securely attach. The only research that we could find on this topic were 3 studies that considered the link between parents holding infants in a sling for at least 3 hours a day to reduce their baby's extended bouts of crying. Nothing on attachment specifically. And if you're curious though, one of the studies found that baby wearing reduced the duration, although not frequency, of the crying, but the other 2 studies showed no impact. Conclusion. You can wear your baby in a sling, but it won't mean your baby attaches. Okay, so that's 4 rules of attachment parenting and no good academic research to back them up. And then there's this. Remember Alan Schroff and the strange situation procedure? So Alan has spent decades testing the effects of secure attachment. You can think of Alan as the prophet of attachment, and William Sears, with his 1.5 million books sold, as the televangelist. So what does Professor Alan Schroff think of the rules of attachment parenting?
Those prescriptions are not based in any solid research findings. It oversimplifies what's involved, and it makes it sound like it is simply a list of things, and if you check those off, then you don't have to worry about anything else.
Schroff says attachment parenting's guidelines can make perfectly good parents feel guilty and inadequate. And he says the answer to the question, how do I get my child to securely attach, is a lot less prescriptive.
it doesn't have to be anything like perfect. When we looked at the parenting, we did a lot of home observation, and we were amazed at how robust infants were, how broad the boundaries are of what adequate care is.
In fact, according to Alan, the majority of kids, 70 to 80%, will securely attach. No sling wearing required. Conclusion. There's no good scientific evidence that attachment parenting leads to kids who are attached. Now that's settled, it's time to ask, how much does secure attachment actually determine a kid's future success? Well, Alan's decades-long study found that whether a kid is securely attached predicted how well they did at school, how good they were at making friends and having romantic relationships, and even their personal sense of responsibility. But how well it predicted this might surprise you. It turns out that by age 19, secure attachment accounts for 5% of the difference between the children with those good qualities and those without. We asked Alan about this, and he acknowledged that securely attaching as a baby was a weak predictor for life success. He said that all kinds of other influences in later childhood and early adulthood also have power in shaping who we become. Things like our relationships with our siblings, the quality of the schools we go to, if we have bad experiences in life that have nothing to do with our parents. But Alan, as well as other scientists that we talked to for this episode, said the fact that secure attachment as a baby continues to positively influence you at all into your adulthood is still significant. So while 5% might not sound like a lot, it's still something. But you know what counts for more than 5% of our personality when we're all grown up? Our genetics.
So parenting within the normal range, when it's not neglectful and it's not abusive, usually only has limited influence. There's still some influence of the parent, but I mean, we only talk about small change in the child's behavior.
Reut Avinun from Hebrew University of Jerusalem researches how genes affect the relationship between children and their parents. She told us that her work and the work of many others shows how important genetics are. So, for example, a US research team analysed dozens of studies looking at the association between parenting and chronic childhood anxiety, and they found that parenting accounted for only 4% of the difference between chronically anxious and non-anxious children. But other studies using identical twins found that genetics explains between 30 to 80% of the difference. Similar results have been found with depression. So, while creating secure attachment is important, genetics matters too. And as Reut and I were talking, I was reminded of a poem, as I often am. It's called This Be the Verse by Philip Larkin, and it starts with, they f*** you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and some extra just for you. Why do you think what do you think?
Yeah, I actually do know this one. I actually think that this is exactly why it's important to show how limited parental influence is, because I think that children blame their parents a lot, and they think that if they're unsuccessful, that if they're anxious or whatever, then they always blame the parents. I mean, it's nice to blame our parents, but it's not really based on research.
Conclusion. Genetics matter. It plays an important role in our personality, our intelligence, and our mental health. But it's really hard to build a movement and sell books with the message, sorry, your kid's just born that way. So, does attachment parenting stack up? Science says no. What we've learned is that we can push our kids around in strollers. We can bottle feed them. We can let them sleep in their cribs. We can let them cry a little and still be good parents. On the other hand, you can breastfeed your kids until kingdom come. You can not sleep train them and they'll still be fine. We cannot be clearer. There is no good scientific evidence that by following the rules of attachment parenting, you'll end up with better kids. So why is it such a popular idea? Well, being a parent is scary. the mums and dads that I've talked to while working on this story, including our own Heather Rogers, all say that having so much control over this little human being, all the choices that entails, can feel overwhelming and the stakes can feel so high. But if you sacrifice all of your time, all of your energy, just like some of these websites and books tell you to, then maybe you can say, I've done everything I could. I've left no stone unturned. Heather put our scientific findings to Judy. She told her that the academic in attachment research, Alan Schroff, doesn't agree with the primary tenets of attachment parenting.
He's saying that every parent who's attentive and is a good parent, but that gives people so many options that they don't really know what to do. I mean, that means everything's okay, so then how do you decide what to do?
I know, like when I had my son, I mean, ever since then, I just am kind of floored by how many decisions I have to make and how big they feel. I'm plagued by doubt.
I'm doubting that I should have done it. I mean, in some ways when it's really hard, or I'm always thinking like, yeah, sometimes it would be good to just say goodnight and leave them in the room because that's easier for me.
But so why make all the sacrifices?
Because I can't stand the crying. And I think that it's
it's for you.
It's for me. If I didn't answer their cry, I couldn't manage, so I'd be too anxious.
Yes, having a baby is scary, but that's no reason to follow bad advice. That's Science versus Attachment Parenting. This episode has been produced by Heather Rogers, who interviewed our attachment parent Judy, and also Caitlin Kenny and Caitlin Sori. Edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Alex Bloomberg. Production assistance by Austin Mitchell and Stevie Lane. Thanks to everyone at Gimlet who told us about their children. Even more thanks to everyone at Gimlet who didn't tell us about their children. Sound design and music production by Matthew Boll. Music was written by Bobby Lord. Science versus.
This episode is brought to you by Capital One. With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts, is it even a decision? Get started today. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account with Capital One, and there's no minimum to open and keep your account. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One NA, member FDIC.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Gimlet Media's Science Versus, the show where we pit facts against all that stuff your uncle says. On today's show, guns. In America, the gun lobby says that guns keep us safe, protect us against criminals, and reduce the crime rate. But what does the science say? A quick warning before we get started. This episode contains the sounds of guns and we'll be discussing homicide, suicide, and domestic violence. Please take care when listening to this show. And if you're feeling depressed or you just want to talk to someone, in the US, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That number will be on our website along with other resources. Nestled in the heartland of New Jersey amongst a nail salon and car wash sits Gun for Hire, a gun range that bills itself as the only family destination gun range in the world. And the guy I'm here to see is Anthony Calandro.
Anthony!
He's the owner at this joint, and he's like a celebrity around here. He seems to know who everyone is, and he's shaking hands with all the customers. Anthony tells me I have to wait my turn.
How's everything? You doing all right?
I'm doing good.
You can talk to me later if you want.
I figured there was one obvious way to kill some time while I waited for Anthony.
All right, so we're going to put you in the range for an hour. 15 minutes, you're going to be with an instructor. You have an AR-15 and a Glock 19, a box of ammo for 9mm, 2 boxes of .223, 4 targets.
Well, I didn't know how long he was going to be.
That close the gun is now loaded. You have 3 shots. There you go.
How did I do.
These are your 3 shots.
Is that good?
Yes, very
shaking
good.
your head.
Very good, very good.
Shaking your head.
When I finished my 70 rounds at Gun for Hire, Anthony Calandro was ready to chat. But before I could start asking questions...
Quick question to you. Your perception of gun ranges before you started visiting them, didn't you think that everybody in there would look like Duck Dynasty characters?
I did. This is absolutely true.
That's 50 years of the media perpetuating us as fat white guys with summer teeth, some over here, with a beard and suspenders and a baseball cap on and my Bible in my left hand and clinging to my gun in my right hand. Am I right?
Okay, so Anthony, he has teeth, doesn't wear suspenders, and no Bible that I could see. Which isn't to say that you'll mistake this place for the UN. On our way to the interview, we did walk past this room full of dudes.
What is that?
That's the diversity shoot. We had a bunch of people come in and shoot for the first time.
They don't look very diverse, Anthony.
They're not very diverse.
What demographic would you put them at?
Right now, looks like they're installing a new Grand Wizard. What it looks like to me right now.
Today, we are putting down the guns and picking up the books to find out what guns do to a community. And I know in America, guns are a huge topic, and this is a very loaded debate. So we will be breaking this issue into 2 parts. This week, we will answer the following bullet points. 1, how many times a year are guns used for good? Say, in self-defense. 2, how many times a year are guns used for bad, like to murder someone? And 3, what effect, if any, do guns have on the overall crime rate? And then next week, we're going to stare down the barrel of gun control, so whether laws that restrict guns actually save lives. Now, to be clear, although the Constitution is a lovely document, it's not a peer-reviewed journal. So you will be hearing the words the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms only once in this podcast. And you just heard them, because today we're talking science. Let's get into it. Bullet point number 1, self-defense. Best estimates suggest there are more than 300 million guns in the US right now, a number that has been slowly rising. And I say best estimates because no one really knows. Guns aren't traced very effectively around the states. Still, a recent Pew survey suggests that 34% of US homes have guns in them. And the main reason Americans buy guns, according to the Pew survey, is to defend themselves and their property. The survey found that almost half of Americans who own guns say they have it for protection. And this idea that you need a gun to protect yourself is promoted by the National Rifle Association.
The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
This is Wayne LaPierre, CEO of the NRA. He's speaking at a press conference.
And when you hear your glass breaking at 3 a.m. and you call 911, you won't be able to pray hard enough for a gun in the hands of a good guy to get there fast enough to protect you.
And Anthony Calandro, owner of Gun for Hire, he agrees with this.
There's an old saying, when you need help in seconds, the police arrive in minutes. But if you're home alone, who's going to protect you? If 2 men were trying to break into your house, a firearm is the ultimate equalizer.
Anthony says he's never had to use a gun to protect himself, but he likes the idea that he's ready if anything would happen.
When I go to a restaurant, I sit with my back to the wall because I need to see who's coming in and out and watch everything because no one's sneaking up on me.
It's pretty sad that's what it's come down to.
I have no idea. I think some people are born that way. And I was born that way. You know, they say, what do they call it? Sheepdog? If you're born that way, you have that sheepdog mentality. It's just the way I am.
But how many people in America will actually use their guns for self-defense? Well, there is one number that gets cited quite a bit in the media.
There are 2.5 million defensive uses of guns every year.
It's like 2.5 million.
2.5 million times a year.
2.5 million times.
2.5 million times last year, law-abiding citizens pulled guns in self-defense and saved lives.
So let's take a closer look at this number. Where did it come from, and can we trust it? Let's start with the man responsible for it, Gary Kleck. He's a professor of criminology at Florida State University, and he's been writing about guns for decades. Do you own a gun yourself?
I never answer that question. The reason being that people use it as an excuse for not thinking about the issues, but just judging what people have to say, and that's foolish.
Gary's study was the first to come up with this number, that there are 2.5 million defensive gun users. And here's how he got it. Back in the early 1990s, Gary's team surveyed just under 5,000 people to ask them, have you used a gun, even if it wasn't fired, for self-protection or the protection of property at home, work, or elsewhere? And he found that 1.3%, that is 66 people, said that they had. So then...
You take the percent of the sample who said they had that experience and multiply it times the population.
So he took those 66 people, that 1.3%, and multiplied it by the adult population of the US, which equals... Okay, so you got to carry the 1 and...
2.5 million times a year.
You never, ever sort of do that. You never extrapolate like that.
This is David Hemenway, a professor of health policy at Harvard University. And he takes issue with Gary's methods.
Nobody who has any training in epidemiology would ever extrapolate the 1% of people.
David says multiplying out 1.3%, which in this study, remember, was only 66 people, to the population of America is dangerous. And here's why. Let me give you an example. A recent US survey of more than 5,000 women who had been pregnant found that 45 women, or 0.8% of them, consistently affirmed that they had had a virgin birth. The survey was published in the British Medical Journal. Now, if you pull a Gary Kleck and multiply that out to the number of women who gave birth in, say, 2013, you'd find that there would be around 31,000 women in America who were virgins when they had their bubs. So, in just a decade, there might be 310,000 Jesus babies. Well, hallelujah! The point is, they were mistaken. They had sex and then they had babies. The other point is that when you're talking about very small percentages being multiplied out to very big populations, a few people being mistaken can lead to a very big wrong number, which is why no scientist would say that there were 31,000 virgin births in the US in 2013. I asked Gary about whether his very big number on defensive gun uses might also have this problem.
The percentage point is very small. So if you're a little bit off, then actually it's orders of magnitude that this figure could be wrong, right?
Not if it's a little bit off. It could be orders of magnitude off if it's way off.
But if it's, say, 1 percentage point off, this could be a problem.
You can speculate anything if it were, but of course we don't have the slightest evidence to support that view, and we have ample evidence to contradict it, which is the results of the other surveys, which always indicate huge numbers of defensive gun uses.
Yes, other surveys do exist, and yes, they have gotten similar figures, around 1%. But David Hemenway, who has actually done some of these surveys, says that just because you can replicate a result, it doesn't mean it's true. Why? Because sometimes people lie, leave stuff out, or just misremember, and they do it in the same pattern over and over again. David points to surveys about how many sexual partners straight men and women have had.
So you can ask people in the United States over and over and over, and the men will always tell you more than the women. That doesn't mean that's true. And you're just looking at heterosexual couples. It doesn't mean it's true.
That is, either there is a small group of horny women out there, and props to them, or men are lying, or women are lying, or both are lying. Given what we know about people, it's likely that someone is lying. And David Hemingway thinks this is what is happening in these gun surveys. Just like when you ask guys, how many people have you slept with? If you ask Americans how many times they've used their gun defensively, they tend to inflate the number. So, if Gary's numbers are wrong, do we have any idea how many people use their guns defensively in America each year? Yes, we do. Meet the National Crime Victimization Survey. Forget Gary's 5,000 people and extrapolating. This beast interviews around 90,000 people, so it's much more reliable. And it's considered the gold standard amongst researchers in this field. But it's not just the size of this survey that makes it more trustworthy. It's also the way they ask the questions. So rather than straight out asking people, do you use your gun for self-protection, which can overestimate results because people like to boast, this survey first establishes that someone was the victim of a crime. And then they ask, did you do anything with the idea of protecting yourself or your property while the incident was going on?
Freeze, you diseased rhinoceros pizzle.
Now, according to data from this survey, there are only around 100,000 defensive gun uses per year in the US. So that's much smaller than Gary collects 2.5 million. And when you look into the details of this survey, you find that a lot of common images that we have about guns that are used defensively don't hold up. Hold up! So for example, more than 80% of the time, the people who said they used their gun defensively also said that they were the only person with the gun in the altercation. So much for a good guy with a gun facing off against a bad guy with a gun. Another image that the gun lobby likes to promote is a woman pulling out a gun to protect herself against a man in an alley or trying to break into her home. This is from a 2013 speech by the NRA's Wayne LaPierre.
The one thing a violent rapist deserves to face is a good woman with a gun.
Firstly, only 13% of rapes in the US are committed by strangers. Most rapists are known to the victim. They're often married or related to her. So the vast majority of sexual assaults aren't happening in dark alleyways. And then when we look at the crime victimization survey, of the 337 women in the sample who had been sexually assaulted, none used a gun in self-defense. And just to challenge one more popular image that we have, you brandish your gun, and the bad guy flees. Well, sometimes things don't turn out that way. Using data from that big survey, David Hemingway found that when people used a gun to protect their property, it did work 2/3 of the time.
Yes, there's a bit of suggestive evidence that having a gun may reduce property loss, but the evidence is equally compelling that having mace or a baseball bat will reduce property loss.
In other words, just yelling at the guy, turning on the lights, or threatening to call the police were pretty good tactics too. When people did that, it worked about half the time. Conclusion. Best estimates reckon there are around 100,000 defensive gun users in America each year. Not 2.5 million. And using guns in self-defense is slightly more effective at scaring bad guys than doing other things, but we've got to weigh this small benefit against the bad things that guns can do. And that's coming up after the break.
Hello, I'm Mallory Rubin.
And I'm Van Lathan.
Check out the Ringerverse podcast from The Ringer for all things superhero movies, nerd culture, and fandom entertainment.
We have instant reviews and fun takes on all the latest news and more, available now on Spotify.
Welcome back to Science Versus. That was too peppy. We're talking about guns. Welcome back to Science Versus. When we talk about gun deaths in America, the public often focuses on accidental deaths, often involving kids, and also mass shootings. These are horrifying, but they're rare. More than 30,000 people in America die from guns annually. On top of that, there are more than 81,000 non-fatal gun injuries. And according to Professor David Hemingway's research, of the 30,000 annual gun deaths, around 110 kids are killed accidentally by firearms each year. Mass shootings are harder to put a figure on because people have different definitions of mass. But any way you count them, the maximum number of deaths each year is in the hundreds, not thousands. So they are a very small proportion of overall gun homicides. So, who's doing most of the shooting and killing? Well, most of the time, it's people killing themselves. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about 2/3 of America's gun deaths are suicides. But when you talk to people like Anthony Calandro, owner of Gun for Hire, they don't think that guns are the problem.
Suicides are tragedy. And if you press the button tomorrow and all guns in this country disappeared, the suicide rate's not going to go down. The avenue or choice of taking their own lives is going to change. Hanging, drowning, asphyxiation, pills, whatever it may be, that's all that's going to happen. It's just that the firearm is a very easy tool, a very easy vehicle to help with that. But if you're set on killing yourself, you are going to do it. It doesn't matter what you have accessible to you.
In suicide research, Anthony's argument is called substitution. This is the idea that if you remove one way for people to kill themselves, they'll just substitute it for another. Now, this theory of substitution has actually been studied internationally, looking at many ways that people suicide. Professor Helen Christensen is an expert in suicide prevention. She heads up the Black Dog Institute in Sydney, Australia.
So if you took away a particular way in which people die, do you get an outbreak and a greater number doing it in a different way? And there's been quite a bit of research, for example, putting barriers on bridges. Do people just move 2 kilometres further down the river and jump from the next bridge? And the answer is no.
And there's no reason to think that guns or firearms would be any different?
In my view, no.
Over and over, evidence suggests that if you eliminate a popular way that people suicide, fewer people kill themselves. And this is known as means restriction. Here's an example. In the 1980s, a common method of suicide in Sri Lanka was swallowing certain pesticides. And after the country banned them, the total suicide rate fell by 50%. Now, there was a minor increase in hangings, but this didn't come close to offsetting the total number of lives saved. This has also specifically been seen with guns. In Australia, after a gunman killed 35 people in Tasmania in 1996, heavy gun restrictions were implemented. And once the bans kicked in, there was a slight increase in hangings, but the total suicide rate dropped. For men, it was by 8%. Every study I've seen and every academic I've spoken to agreed that restricting access to guns would significantly reduce suicides. Every academic except Professor Gary Kleck, because he said there's no real difference between people trying to kill themselves with a gun or with a rope.
It's just tying a piece of rope around your neck.
Are you saying that it is just as easy to kill yourself using a gun as it is to hang yourself?
No, what I said is that people who are that seriously motivated will take the somewhat longer period of time it takes to prepare a hanging suicide attempt than it does to shoot yourself. The difference is a matter of minutes. You can do it in under a minute with a gun, and well, maybe it'd take 10 minutes to do it by hanging. And so the question is, are seriously intended suicide attempters willing to take 10 minutes to make the attempt? Yeah, I'd say it's almost certain that they would be.
But suicide researcher Helen Christensen says this idea that time doesn't matter isn't true for the vast majority of people who kill themselves.
Time is your friend in suicide prevention. So the argument is within 10 minutes, for example, of making the full intention to take your own life, many people do attempt within that tiny window. The longer you allow the person with this thought to be delayed, then the more likely it is that they will in fact survive.
Conclusion. The current evidence suggests that for most people, Thoughts of suicide come at a time of acute crisis. They're not carefully planning their death, which is why removing deadly means from vulnerable people is such a powerful way to prevent suicide. You can think about it like this. When your friend or lover or child is feeling very low, you don't want them to have access to a gun. We still need to look at murders and violent crimes. But before we do that, let's take a little break. It's getting pretty heavy here. Let's all take a big breath while I tell you about some very cool octopuses. Yes. They're called the southern sand octopuses, and they're found on the eastern coast of Australia. And it was recently discovered that these octopuses create houses for themselves under the bottom of the sea. Using their ingenuity and bodily fluid, they line the burrow of these little apartments they create for themselves with mucus so that it gives it more structure. And then they create little chimneys for ventilation. Isn't that amazing? It's remarkable. Oh, and don't send me letters because the plural, the collective noun of octopus is octopuses. Sometimes people say octopi because they think that octopus comes from Latin, in which case the plural would be I. But actually, octopus is borrowed from Greek. So you add es if you want to make it a plural. So that would be octopuses. And you should use that word as often as possible because octopuses are cool. So, back to guns and on to the next argument. The gun lobby says that guns not only help people to defend against crime, as we talked about, but they argue that if law-abiding citizens are armed, then criminals will be deterred. That is, they reckon that the mere presence of a gun not only could be used to stop someone who's in the middle of committing a crime, but it could be used to stop them before the crime even happens. Burglaries, assaults, murders, all of it.
There are AR-15s, shotguns, and pistols all around you that deter crime and violence every day.
This is NRA News commentator Dom Raso.
On armed citizens. The presence of weapons alone can stop crime. And when you take them away, the bad guys have the upper hand.
So, do guns reduce crime? Well, according to Fox News commentators, yes. And they invoke studies to make their claim. Here's commentator John Stossel speaking with Megyn Kelly.
The jury is still out on the global warming theory.
Whoops, sorry. It's just in my folder of outdated science that gets cited. Here it is, John Stossel and Megyn Kelly.
The best example is concealed carry. In the states where they passed the laws, crime, gun crime, murder went down after states passed concealed carry laws.
Why? Why is that?
Because the bad guys start thinking, gee, if I rob this guy, he might be packing.
Okay, this claim has been firmly debunked by the scientific community. And to understand the whole story, we have to go back. Not that far back. Nice. We are in the 1980s when a bunch of US states unintentionally set up a nice experiment. These states passed laws making it easier for people to carry concealed weapons, so-called right to carry laws. And by doing that, it allowed scientists to measure the crime rate before and after the laws were passed. To answer the question, do legal guns on the street really mean less crime? Economist John Lott, who at the time worked for the University of Chicago, was one of the first academics to publish on the case. Using some statistical models, he reported a significant drop in violent crimes in states that had passed the gun laws. This work was published in 1997, and John went on to write a very cryptically titled book called More Guns, Less Crime. These days, John is no longer aligned to a university and is instead a Fox News columnist. Meanwhile, a bunch of other scientists still working for universities have looked into John's work and found serious flaws within it. When one academic tried to replicate the findings, he couldn't. And this led an expert committee of some 20 scientists to reanalyze the data And while John still maintains the accuracy of his findings, this committee found, quote, no credible evidence that the passage of right to carry laws decreases or increases violent crime, end quote. Okay, so people carrying their guns around doesn't affect the crime rate. But what happens when you take into account the guns in people's homes? Do the number of guns in a state affect the overall crime rate? No. Here's David Hemenway.
Guns don't cause violent crime. Guns also don't seem to protect against violent crime. Guns don't reduce violent crime. Whether there's guns or not, you can have violent crime.
There are US states with lots of guns that have a low crime rate, like Montana, and there are US states with lots of guns with a high crime rate, like Alaska. Equally, around the world, while the US has a bucket load more guns than any other high-income country, the crime rate over here is just average. And for more evidence that the number of guns and the crime rate are unrelated, we need to go back. No! From the mid-1990s, crime rates plummeted around the developed world. Burglaries, thefts, assaults all dropped. And this trend lasted about a decade. And it was so mysterious that academics have spent the last 2 decades trying to figure out what happened. With no concrete answers on the table, 3 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences put together a crack team of scientists, which included David, to finally uncover why the crime rate fell.
After 3 years of study, I can confidently say the 24 of us, mostly criminologists, really don't have any good idea.
They looked at data on all the obvious stuff: the economy, unemployment, social trends like immigration, but also other things.
Things like better policing and the notion of fewer people in prison, and the idea about less lead in the water, in the air, and abortion.
And of course, guns. But nothing could explain what happened. Now, it's true that as the crime rate in America was falling in the 1990s, the number of guns in the country was going up. And the NRA likes to take this as proof that more guns means less crime. But according to David Hemenway and the team, if you keep watching the crime statistics after that initial drop in the mid-90s, you'll see that that relationship between guns and crime changes. Which is why
zero of our group thought that the number of guns had anything to do with the reduction in crime and homicide.
So, even though the number of guns in America continues to slowly rise, the crime rate has bobbed up and down throughout the noughties and even today. The noughties, as in the 2000s. I didn't even mean it like a pun. Like, they're naughty, they're doing crime. It's just what you call the 2000s. There's no other better. The 2000s sounds weird. It does. It sounds weird. What else? The zeros? The double zeros? The OOs? No, the oohs? The oohs. The turn of the century. No, it's called the noughties. The point is, the crime rate is still going up and down. The number of guns in America are rising. There is no connection. Conclusion. Guns do not affect the crime rate. They don't make it go up or down in any consistent way. Well, there is one exception. Guns do not have an impact on the overall violent crime rate. They don't affect the number of assaults or rapes or burglaries, but they do have an effect on one particular violent crime: homicide. Here's David.
What guns do is they make hostile interactions, robberies, assaults much more deadly.
What he means is that if you put a gun in the middle of an altercation, it's more likely that someone will die. In the US, 16,000 people are killed in a homicide each year, and the majority, 11,000, are killed with guns. And when we look at the US, states with more guns tend to have more homicides and more firearm-related homicides. But there are exceptions. So you can find states like Idaho, for example, with lots of guns, but not a lot of murders per capita. But there is one subset of the homicide rate where the correlation between guns and death is rock solid. And that's the female homicide rate. A paper published this year tracked firearm ownership and homicides across 50 states over 33 years, and it found that it was unambiguous. The more guns in a state, the more likely it is that a woman will be murdered. If the gun ownership in a state goes up by 10 percentage points, the female firearm-related murder rate goes up by 10%. Now, we're not exactly sure why the link between statewide gun ownership and murder is stronger for women than men, but women are more likely to be killed by someone they know, while men are killed in greater numbers and more often by a stranger. And one idea is that because men are often killed by strangers, their murders depend on a lot of other factors, like the overall level of violence in a state, while violence against women depends much less on these factors. That is, women are being abused everywhere, but the likelihood that one will die depends on who has access to guns. Conclusion: guns don't affect the crime rate, but guns do make crimes more deadly. Chuck a gun in the middle of an assault, and it's more likely that someone will die. So, when it comes to science versus guns, do the claims stack up? Bullet point number 1. There are 2.5 million defensive gun uses in America each year. The science says no. According to the research, the actual number is around 100,000, and that includes defending property, stuff in your house. Next bullet point. Guns reduce crime. The science says no. Guns do not affect the crime rate. They don't make it go up, and they don't make it go down. But they do make altercations more deadly, which is why more guns, on average, means more murders. So if the data are pretty clear, why is there a big debate? Why all the fuss around guns? According to David Hemingway, this is more about human nature than science. Because the thing is, for people who have a gun, there is a very small chance that something will ever go wrong.
Serious injuries are fairly rare. So people will say, oh, I had a gun in my house, when I was growing up and nobody ever died. Great. I mean, but because the gun was in your house, there was 3 times the likelihood that somebody would die. But they think, their evidence from their own experiences, things are good, things are fine.
And for gun owner Anthony Calandro, everything has been fine so far. So he thinks nothing needs to change.
And why wouldn't you personally want to give some guns up to make America safer, if that's what the studies showed?
Because I am safe and my guns are not hurting anybody. Last time I checked, none of my guns ever left the safe and went out and committed crimes in the middle of the night while I was sleeping.
If this perfect study came up and just found that if you removed the guns in America, you would have a homicide rate that dropped, the perfect study, would you want action to happen?
Probably not. Probably not, because we all want to blame everybody else and not ourselves. It's okay to take his guns away, but not my guns. Come on, it's just like when you were a kid, you had a toy, you didn't play with, and when your mom wanted to give it away, all of a sudden you wanted it again, right? I know that I'm safe, and I know I'm diligent with my guns, so nobody's taking my guns.
And the thing is, while Anthony is trained and safe with his guns, and maybe you'd rather be in a dark alleyway with him than without him, the science tells us that the more people who think like Anthony, the more guns there are around, ultimately, the more people die. That's Science versus Guns. Stay tuned after the break for a sneak peek at next week's show. This episode has been produced by Caitlin Kenny, Heather Rogers, and Caitlin Sori, edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Alex Bloomberg. Production assistance by Austin Mitchell, and fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Special thanks to Shruti Pinamaneni, Diane Wu, and Stevie Lane. Sound design and music production by Martin Peralta and Matthew Bowl. Music written by Bobby Lord.
If it seems like there are a lot of people quitting their jobs right now, it's because they are.
We're working so hard that we forgot to think about what makes us happy.
I would just sit at my desk and cry.
I just got to the point where I had to say, I don't know if I can do this.
And it's not just quitting. There's a lot of unusual things happening in the economy. car shortages, soaring lumber prices, inflation. We cover all this and more on The Journal podcast, out every weekday afternoon. Tap now to listen to The Journal on Spotify.
Choose your own offline listening adventure. Spotify Premium lets you download and take your music on the go. Try 3 free months of Premium now and cancel anytime. Tap the banner to learn more.
Next time on Science Versus, it's part 2 of our look at guns in America. We're doing science versus gun control. What saves lives and what doesn't? You might be surprised.
And the real irony is that handgun crime doubled in Britain.
Plus, we'll tell you what this sound is. I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Gimlet Media's Science Versus. This is the show where we pit facts against truthiness. On today's show, it's part 2 of our look at guns in America, and today we're asking, do laws that control guns save lives? A quick warning before we get started. We'll be discussing homicide and suicide, so please take care when listening to this show. Now, last week we looked at defensive gun uses and the number of homicides and suicides that are caused by guns in America. If you haven't heard that episode, we do recommend that you go back and listen. But as a recap, we talked about how there are more than 30,000 gun deaths in America each year, and 2/3 of those are suicides. We also went through the connection between the number of guns and the crime rate. And spoiler alert, there isn't one. Guns don't make the crime rate go up or down in any consistent way. But they do make altercations, assaults, and burglaries more deadly. This is part 2. And in this episode, we're talking about how to reduce the number of people being killed and hurt by guns. Now, if public health professionals found a lamp with a genie inside, they'd probably make a wish that all the guns could just disappear. But they'd also probably make the sugar disappear and the alcohol disappear and the drugs disappear. But that's magic and a bit boring, and definitely not science. So, we're not going to talk about genies today or a gunless world. Instead, we're focusing on how gun regulations can actually effectively reduce gun deaths. And that means regulating who can buy them, what kind of guns they can buy, and what people are allowed to do with their guns. Okay, let's start with a quick explanation of how people buy guns in America right now. Bob Costaris, owner of Classic Pistol in Southampton, Pennsylvania, showed Science Versus producer Heather Rogers how to buy a gun.
Hi, Heather. I'm Bob. You come in here and sit in the lounge.
There's like guns on your desk and guns on the floor and guns leaning against the wall.
That's what we do for a living here. We're a gun shop. We have guns.
Laws about what you need to do to buy a gun vary state by state in the United States, but everyone in America who buys a firearm from a licensed dealer has to fill out the same federal form. And it's poetically titled the 4473. Bob showed it to Heather.
It's the name, address, social security number, date of birth, the weight, the height, the sex of the person, gender, their race, and then the questions. Are you the actual buyer of the firearm listed on this form? Have you ever been convicted of a felony or any other crime, which you could have gone to jail for a year or more, even if they put you on probation?
Okay, once you've filled out the form, Bob gets in touch with the police, who use the FBI system called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System to look for red flags.
They run the check for us. They do all the database checking. They come back with an approval number or a denial or research.
Research means the police need more time to give an answer, and denied means, surprise, surprise, you're not allowed to get a gun. And why would you be denied? Well, because under US federal law, certain people are prohibited from buying guns, like those who have been convicted of a crime and sentenced to more than 1 year in prison, or those who have been found by a court to be mentally ill. There are other reasons, we're not going to go into all of them here. And there are all kinds of exceptions to this system. The biggest one is that in some states, it's legal to buy a gun through a private sale. Essentially, any random person with no background check at all. But still, this is what America has today. It also has a firearm homicide rate that is 25 times higher than the average for other high-income countries, and a suicide rate that is 8 times higher. So, when it comes to gun control, there's lots of opinions, and even some songs.
But you can be 100% positive that when a crazy person shoots someone, you know Obama's gonna blame the gun.
But then, there's science. Many people on both sides of the gun debate will tell you how we can fix America's gun laws. Let's get into some of the main ideas. Round number 1, better background checks. Round number 2, regulating guns and removing certain types of guns from the community. Round number 3, requiring guns to be registered just like cars, so that every time guns change hands, the government knows about it. Okay, let's get into it. Round number 1, better background checks. If you ask the NRA why there are 10,000 gun homicides in America each year, one thing they'll cite is holes in the FBI's background check system. Essentially, the system that Bob reaches out to when you buy a gun at his store. Here's NRA CEO Wayne LaPierre.
The names of millions of violent felons, criminal gangbangers, and adjudicated mentally incompetent and dangerous people are missing from the background check system.
Yes. The current background check system in America is missing the criminal and mental health records of loads of Americans, which means that people who aren't supposed to be buying guns legally at a store can.
You know, our criminal justice reporting system is a hodgepodge of 50 state systems feeding into the FBI's NCIC.
Mark Jones is a retired special agent for America's guns watchdog, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. And by the way, the NCIC is the FBI's criminal record system.
So what happens at NCIC is that often arrest records make it in very well. Conviction records are more spotty typically.
And this is partly because getting states and government agencies to put records into the background check system is voluntary. So some states just don't do it that well. So what would happen if we fixed this and had all the records on every person who fell into a prohibited category? Would it make a difference? Yes. One study analysing a number of things related to background checks, including record keeping, found that states with the worst background check system tended to have the highest gun homicide rate. And they wrote that this was, quote, a clear and consistent negative association, end quote. But still, there is a limit to how far these background checks can go. Because the majority of criminals don't get their guns from licensed dealers like Bob. So these criminals won't be going through a background check system. A survey of around 1,400 inmates in prison for a crime involving a gun found that 77% of them got guns on the street or through family and friends, and only 11% of them bought a gun through a licensed dealer. Plus, remember that in many US states, you can buy a gun in a private sale without any background check at all. Here's Mark Jones again.
We know that a lot of criminals are getting guns through transactions that don't have any scrutiny on them. To me, that's a real problem.
Another problem with focusing on fixing background check reporting is that many would-be criminals would pass a background check when they bought their gun. That is, they were good guys in the government's eyes up until they used a gun in crime. A paper published last year summarising the available evidence found that, quote, roughly half or more of those who commit gun crimes do not meet any of the prohibiting conditions under federal law, end quote. Plus, 2/3 of gun deaths in America are suicides. And while we couldn't find any specific studies on the topic, one expert that we spoke to said that most suicides would not be prevented through better record keeping in the background checks. Conclusion: better records could help reduce gun deaths. We can't tell you by what percentage because we don't live in an alternate reality with perfect record keeping. But since the majority of criminals don't get their guns in a place where they would need to get a background check, and 50% of gun criminals would have passed a background check anyway because they were good guys when they went to buy their guns, it seems that lots of people would be slipping through the cracks. What if we added new information to the database? Another big idea that people have about making background checks better involves including more information in them, specifically more information about people's mental health. Because ultimately, they believe that if we do this, we can find the people who are going to be violent and stop them from getting a gun. And this idea tends to come up a lot around mass shootings.
There's a common theme you see with many of these mass shootings, and that is the theme of mental illness.
I'm very concerned about the mental health side of this.
A lot of it is just mental illness.
People are going to slip through the cracks. They're mentally ill. There's a huge mental illness problem.
So, is going after mental illness a good strategy to prevent gun crime? Well, one study of 88 mass shooters found that, quote, the overall prevalence of severe mental illness is low, end quote. And away from mass shootings? One study from Sweden found that 95% of all violent crimes were carried out by people who never had a known severe mental illness. 95%. And you can take these figures in two ways. Perhaps a lot of killers are actually sane. Or perhaps these people actually had a mental illness that meant that they were prone to violence, and the system didn't recognise them. They weren't diagnosed. Say we run with argument number 2. If we had better, the best mental health care, could mental health professionals predict who is going to be violent and then stop them from buying a gun? Philip Alpers, a public health associate professor at the University of Sydney, says no. He says that doctors...
They can look at almost all of their patients and not be at all sure what any of them's going to be doing sometime in the future. And that's because they don't know, and nor do we know. Nobody knows reliably who is going to commit gun violence, and if we did know, the problem would be solved.
Philip pointed out that while there are a few mental illnesses that do make people more likely to be violent,
the best mental health professionals, the forensic psychiatrists, the people who interview killers after they've been caught, these are the people who will tell you that their chances of predicting future dangerousness, even in a patient who's totally at their disposal and willing to be interviewed, is not much better than flipping a coin.
Conclusion. Even with a beefed up background check system on the lookout for people about to become violent, we just can't catch them all. Pokemon. So, round 2. Buying guns back from the community. I recently saw a tweet from Harlem's NYPD Blue. Oh, you just say NYPD, don't you? Okay, just saw a tweet from Harlem's NYPD at the 34th Precinct, and I was intrigued. It read, need cash? Turn in an operable handgun. All in caps lock. No questions asked. Tomorrow. No questions asked. I had some questions.
Is that a recording?
No. Yes, of course it is. Are we not allowed?
Is it on?
It is on.
It's on?
It is on.
You can talk to us. You gotta turn it off.
Police officers wouldn't let me go inside or ask them any questions, so I didn't know how many guns got turned in. But then, on the way home, I saw another tweet. Feel a little safer today? ? 81 guns off our street, turned in anonymously at our gun, $, buyback event. Hashtag one less gun. The thing is, we probably shouldn't feel too much safer. These small buybacks haven't been shown by science to be effective. For example, after tracking 5 years of these sorts of gun buybacks carried out by the local police in Buffalo, New York, researchers concluded that the buybacks did not significantly reduce homicides. The researchers noted that most other evaluations of buybacks in other parts of the United States have found the same thing. They ultimately concluded, quote, gun buyback programs appear to satisfy a local administrator's need for instant solutions to a problem despite a lack of evidence demonstrating effectiveness. End quote. And sick burn. So, when I saw that tweet, I thought to myself, 81 guns off the street? That's not a buyback. This is a buyback. You're hearing the sounds of guns being crushed in the biggest buyback program that the world has ever seen. After the break, the NRA's biggest fear. What happened when Australia took away hundreds of thousands of guns from the public?
Or not.
Welcome back to Science Versus. So, we're talking about gun control, and we've landed in Australia, the land of sun. Even with a beefed up background check system on the lookout for people about to become violent, we just can't catch them all. Pokemon. So, round 2. Buying guns back from the community. I recently saw a tweet from Harlem's NYPD Blue. Oh, you just say NYPD, don't you? Okay, just saw a tweet from Harlem's NYPD at the 34th Precinct, and I was intrigued. It read, need cash? Turn in an operable handgun. All in caps lock. No questions asked. Tomorrow. No questions asked. I had some questions.
All right, where am I?
Is that recording?
No. Yes, of course it is. Are we not allowed?
Is it on?
It is on.
It's on?
It is
Yes.
on.
Armin
Talk to us,
Keys.
but you gotta turn it off.
Police officers wouldn't let me go inside or ask them any questions, so I didn't know how many guns got turned in. But then, on the way home, I saw another tweet. Feel a little safer today? Question mark. 81 guns off our street. Turned in anonymously at our gun, $, buyback event. Hashtag one less gun. The thing is, we probably shouldn't feel too much
You're
safer.
like, what the
These
fuck?
small
Why
buybacks
does that do
haven't
that?
been shown by science to be effective. For example, after tracking 5 years of these sorts of gun buybacks carried out by the local police in Buffalo, New York, researchers concluded that the buybacks did not significantly reduce homicides. The researchers noted that most other evaluations of buybacks in other parts of the United States have found the same thing. They ultimately concluded, quote, gun buyback programs appear to satisfy a local administrator's need for instant solutions to a problem despite a lack of evidence demonstrating effectiveness. End quote. And sick burn. So, when I saw that tweet, I thought to myself, 81 guns off the street? That's not a buyback. This is a buyback. You're hearing the sounds of guns being crushed in the biggest buyback program that the world has ever seen. After the break, the NRA's biggest fear. What happened when Australia took away hundreds of thousands of guns from the public? Welcome back to Science Versus. So, we're talking about gun control, and we've landed in Australia, the land of sun, beaches, and helpful kangaroos called Skippy.
What's the matter, Skippy? What's got you all excited?
This was really a thing. It was like Lassie,
Excuse
but
me.
it hopped. But Australia is also the land of gun control. We are known for having some of the strictest gun laws in the world. And it all started in response to a horrific mass shooting in a town called Port Arthur in 1996.
Good evening. All Australians tonight share the horror of the Port Arthur massacre. 35 people are dead, 18 are injured.
The lone gunman, armed with a high-powered semi-automatic rifle, opened fire first at a restaurant in the heart of the picturesque Port Arthur penal colony.
Within 12 days of the Port Arthur massacre, the Conservative Prime Minister John Howard announced that semi-automatic and automatic weapons would be banned, and the government then bought those newly illegal guns from the public. Anyone who refused to hand over their weapon was breaking the law and risked jail time. Within a year, 640,000 guns were collected and destroyed. So what happened to gun violence in Australia after that? Let's start with mass shootings. In the 18 years before Australia instituted this ban on thousands of guns, there were 13 mass shootings where 5 or more victims were killed.
But after the gun laws came in, we haven't had a single mass shooting on the same scale.
That's Philip Alpers, our gun control expert from Australia again. And in a paper published this year, he attributed this drop in mass shootings to the ban on semi-automatic and automatic weapons. So, what happens to the numbers when you look at all gun deaths in Australia after the buyback?
In the years after the Australian gun buyback, the risk of dying by gunshot in Australia dropped by half. In fact, by more than half, and it stayed there for 20 years. It has not started to creep up again. And that includes homicide, suicide, and even unintentional gun deaths.
Philip also pointed out that the rate of suicides and homicides that did not involve guns fell over those same years. So it's difficult to show precisely what effect the gun laws played in this decline. To nail that down, Philip says what we need to do is a randomised control trial. He also says that it's hard to imagine how such a trial would take place. Actually, though, it's very easy to imagine how such a trial would take place. What you would need to do is get an island exactly the same as Australia, with the same people, same guns, same culture, and then you wouldn't bring in the gun laws. And then you track the death rate over time and compare it to the death rate in Australia. Obviously, we can't do that. So we have to do other things. Like, say, comparing the gun death rate in Australia to the United States. It's 10 times lower. And for more than a decade, Australia's gun death rate has been on the decline, while America's gun death rate has stayed pretty much the same. Conclusion. What happened in Australia was a public health wet dream. Getting rid of thousands of guns and then What's that, Skip? Oh, yeah. No, I should mention that. Yeah, no, thank you. Very helpful. So, before the buyback, there were over 3 million guns in Australia. And then 640,000 semi-automatics and automatics were taken within a year. But today, how many guns are there in Australia? Yeah, no, Skip, I know the answer. It was a rhetorical question. I knew the answer. Today, there are just over 3 million guns in Australia. So about the same as what they were before the buyback. They're not semi-automatics and automatics, but Australia really has quite a few guns for a country of 23 million people. And quite a few Olympic medals too. Anyway, when Philip talks about the shooting culture in Australia right now, he says, and this is his word, that it's vibrant.
Australia has a vibrant gun culture, a lot of sporting shooters. It's a pleasant sport. I used to partake myself. I still enjoy target shooting when I get the opportunity.
Are you a good shot?
Yes.
How did I know you were going to say that? Continue, sorry. But here's the thing. Even though Australia has about the same number of guns as we did before the buyback, our gun homicide rate and suicide rate remains low. In 2014, there were only 31 gun homicides. So, how can we have so many guns and so few gun deaths? Well, in 1996, Australia didn't just buy back guns, and they didn't just ban semi and fully automatic weapons. the Aussies brought in a whole lot of rules around buying and keeping guns. Today, in Australia, to buy a gun, you need a proof of a genuine reason to own one. Genuine reasons include sporting, hunting, and collecting, but not self-defense. You also have to get a license. You have to register your gun with the government, which means the government has a list of who owns exactly which guns. To sell your gun, it has to go through a licensed dealer, or the sale must be witnessed by a police officer. And if your gun is lost or stolen, you have to report it to the police. And the whole idea behind these laws is so the government can track how guns move around the country, which means that every time a gun changes hands, the government needs to hear about it. Philip summed up these laws quite nicely.
There are three pillars of gun control. One is to license the owner of the firearm, just as we license the owners of cars. And the other is to register the object, to register the gun, just as we do with cars. And the third is to have a presumption that the right to keep and bear arms is not absolute. It is a conditional privilege.
Whoa, Philip, stop. We promised in episode 1 of Science vs. Guns that we wouldn't talk about the Constitution. You're getting mighty close. We're sticking with the science. The important thing here is that Phil says destroying those 640,000 guns probably wasn't the key to the Australian success story. It was all those other laws around it.
These were probably more important even than the buyback because they will last a lot longer.
So let's focus on the effects of registering a gun.
Registration made each shooter personally responsible for each gun in their collection. And that meant that the rate of gun theft dropped by more than half after the new laws were brought in. And that's because people were more responsible for their guns. They locked them up. They took care of them because they had to report them if they were stolen.
And hearing about these Australian laws makes Mark Jones feel really jealous. He says that when he was working with the ATF, he could only dream about having information like this. And without it, he said it made it really easy for guns to slip into the illegal market and hard for police to hold anyone responsible. He walked me through a scenario. Say a gun, a Glock 19, shows up in a crime, and it has a serial number which can be traced back to the manufacturer, Glock. So, Glock then says the gun was sent to Bob's gun store, and Bob then says they sold the gun to me, Wendy. What happens next?
Then ATF would come and knock on your door and say, "Hi, Wendy, I'm Special Agent Jones with ATF. We're investigating the recovery of a firearm. Do you own a Glock 19? And in many cases, the reaction is, I have a Glock 19. Okay, Wendy, where is it? It's in my box in the attic of my house. We go up and you look in the box, there's no gun there. Okay, Wendy, what'd you do with your gun? What happened to it? You say, oh yeah, I had a Glock 19, but I had somebody broke into my house and they took all my stuff. You're basically then in the clear from that.
And with 20 years of experience behind him, Mark says he saw many people wriggle out of legal responsibility this way.
The story that the gun was lost or stolen is a very, very common story amongst straw purchasers or people that had guns and got rid of them.
A straw purchaser is someone who buys a gun for someone else. It's illegal in America, but Mark says it's very hard to police.
So it's a pretty common thing for firearms traffickers to tell the straw purchasers, don't worry, if your name's on this, don't worry about it. If the cops come, just tell them it got stolen. Well, in places that have the law that says you have to report it, that doesn't fly anymore. They got to find another excuse.
Conclusion. In Australia, gun laws worked, but it took a whole lot of measures, registration, licensing, and not just taking away people's guns. But the story doesn't end here. There's another country that has gun laws that are very similar to Australia's. But the effect of some of those laws wasn't as clear. The UK has a very similar system to Australia. So for some time, they've had registration, licensing, and a ban on semi-automatics. And then after a mass shooting in 1996, where 16 children and their teacher were shot and killed, the UK government banned handguns. They then bought them back from citizens. So after the handguns were banned, What happened?
That's the interesting thing.
Peter Squires is a professor of criminology and public policy at the University of Brighton.
The real irony is that in the 4 years after the handgun ban became law, handgun crime doubled in Britain.
After the UK government bought around 160,000 handguns from the public, according to police reports, crimes involving handguns in England and Wales went up. They peaked in 2003, 6 years after the handgun bans kicked in. And Peter says this was partly explained by increased gang activity at the time. And the gangs, he says, they didn't hand in their guns. But there was also some really messy things in the data. For one, in 1998, police changed the way they recorded crime, making it hard to compare the gun stats before and after the buyback. Plus, those gun crime stats in the UK, they include fake guns.
Plastic guns, things that look real, but really only fire a plastic pellet or nothing at all. And of course, if someone sticks one of those in your face, you don't want to know whether it's real or not.
Peter says banning handguns created a market for imitation firearms, and the British gangs were mad for them.
When we had an anti-gang task force in 2008, and they did a load of dawn raids on gang addresses and arrested something like 70 to 80 gang members, and they recovered 1,000 guns, they said. Only 10 of them were real guns. So that's the kind of proportion we're talking about.
And by real, he meant that only 10 of them could fire rounds out of some 1,000 recovered guns. Fake guns was so common in the UK that they became a popular cultural reference. Remember the movie Snatch?
You're having second thoughts. And the fact that you've got replica written down the side of your gun.
But it's also true that not all gun crime was carried out with toys.
And the fact that I've got Desert Eagle written on the side of mine.
And since guns do make altercations more deadly, it was expected that taking away 160,000 handguns would reduce the number of people being killed in a homicide. It didn't though. Gun homicides in the UK actually went up in the years after the bans kicked in. But, and this is really important, it was from a very low base. At its peak, 96 people were killed in a homicide by guns in England and Wales. In a population of around 52 million people at the time, 96 being killed by guns, that's not a whole lot. That same year, more than 230 people were killed in Washington, D.C. alone, and there the population was less than 600,000. Today, there are so few gun homicides in the UK that a paper published this year by Professor David Hemenway at Harvard set the gun homicide rate at 0. Conclusion. When we look at the stats, the handgun bans in 1996 did not have an immediate effect on UK's homicide rate. So, when it comes to science versus gun control, does it stack up? Round 1. Will better record keeping and the background checks prevent gun violence? Yes, but it probably wouldn't do much, because half the people who commit crimes with guns don't fall into the categories prohibited from buying guns, and lots of criminals don't buy guns through an official dealer. Would expanding mental health checks do it? Well, it might catch a few people, but the best experts cannot reliably predict who is going to be violent and who isn't. Round 2. Does buying guns back from gun owners save lives? Well, little programs in churches really can't do much. And even taking hundreds of thousands of guns away doesn't seem to be the key. The science says that what works is comprehensive national laws. Round 3. Does making gun owners get a license and register their guns with the government reduce gun deaths? While the science makes it difficult to prove this sort of thing, Australia and the UK, which have some of the most stringent gun laws in the world, also have a very low gun homicide and suicide rate. But there's something else to think about here, because because when it comes to guns and crime, culture and country are really important. When speaking to Peter Squires about what happened in the UK homicides in the UK, that a paper published this year by Professor David Hemenway at Harvard set the gun homicide rate at 0. Conclusion. When we look at the stats, the handgun bans in 1996 did not have an immediate effect on UK's homicide rate. So,
oh, God damn it.
When it comes to science versus gun control, does it stack up? Round 1. Will better record keeping and the background checks prevent gun violence? Yes, but it probably wouldn't do much, because half the people who commit crimes with guns don't fall into the categories prohibited from buying guns, and lots of criminals don't buy guns through an official dealer. Would expanding mental health checks do it? Well, it might catch a few people, but the best experts cannot reliably predict who is going to be violent and who isn't. Round 2. Does buying guns back from gun owners save lives? Well, little programs in churches really can't do much. And even taking hundreds of thousands of guns away doesn't seem to be the key. The science says that what works is comprehensive national laws. Round 3. Does making gun owners get a license and register their guns with the government reduce gun deaths? While the science makes it difficult to prove this sort of thing, Australia and the UK, which have some of the most stringent gun laws in the world, also have a very low gun homicide and suicide rate. But there's something else to think about here, because when it comes to guns and crime, culture and country are really important. When speaking to Peter Squires about what happened in the UK, he brought up culture.
I think the idea of not feeling safe unless you're packing a gun is quite an alien idea in the UK. And against that, I put quite a lot of the firearms industry marketing that you often see that sort of talks about having to defend yourself in the last resort. People in Britain don't think like that.
And Philip Alpers talked about this kind of thing too. In fact, they both said that the mass shootings the UK and Australia experienced were a tipping point. They changed something within society to make lots of people feel differently about guns. And when they talked about culture, it made me feel really uncomfortable because it felt really unscientific. But coming from Australia, I could tell you, I have noticed there is a real difference in the way that we talk and think about guns. And as an anecdote, Peter said that when the semi-automatic bans kicked in, although there was a backlash from some of the gun-loving community in Australia, even the president of Australia's Association of Professional Shooters was on board.
These are the real crocodile Dundees, the guys who go out and shoot kangaroos with a single shot to the head. But they use single shot guns. And when asked if a semi-automatic was an essential tool, this guy said, "Nah, they're just toys for city boys." And that was the attitude at the time, still is the attitude.
Quick correction here, that guy was a gal, Robin Smith. Back in America though. We couldn't avoid talking about culture either. Or that other C word, the Constitution. When we ran some of the things that Australia did to control guns by our gun shop owner Bob Costaris from Classic Pistol, he brought up culture pretty quickly with our producer Heather Rogers.
So it's like when I buy a car, I have to register it. Like, I kind of think about that.
It's different. I really feel it's different. They're not going to come take your car someday, potentially. Maybe they will. I don't know. They're legally owned by me. Why does the state have to have a record so they can come confiscate them? That's scary.
Why is that scary?
Because our Constitution was written with the Second Amendment to protect gun ownership against an unjust government, so we can defend ourselves against an unjust government. We did it to the British in the Revolutionary War. We'd be drinking tea if we didn't have guns. So, I just don't think there's a gun registration needed. I'm against it.
And this is something we don't have to contend with in Australia. Ah, what's that, Skippy? Can you not interrupt while I'm doing my bit? I just want to finish the show. No, there's no, stop that. Thanks. I appreciate no. I swear, you little kangaroo. That's science versus gun control. Oh, and by the way, that is not what a kangaroo actually sounds like. That was what Skippy sounded like. But this is the actual sound that a kangaroo makes. Stick around for a sneak peek of our next episode of Science Versus. It's science versus organic food. And it won't hit you next week, but the week after. Plus, if you stick around, we say sorry to a bird. And I told you so to a couple of listeners. This episode has been produced by Heather Rogers, Caitlin Kenny, Austin Mitchell, and Caitlin Sorey. Edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Alex Bloomberg. Production assistance by Diane Wu and Shruti Ravindran. Sound design and music production by Matthew Boll, mixed by Martin Peralta and Hayley Shaw, music written by Bobby Lord. Science Versus is a production of Gimlet Media.
This episode is brought to you by Capital One. With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. Even easier than deciding to listen to another episode of your favorite podcast. And with no fees or minimums on checking and savings accounts, is it even a decision? Get started today. It only takes about 5 minutes to open an account with Capital One, and there's no minimum to open and keep your account. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank. Capital One NA, member FDIC.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Gimlet Media's Science Versus. This is the show where we pit facts against foodies. On today's show, science versus organic food. Is it really better for you and for the environment? We're going to start today on Reeves Farm. It's a big family-owned farm in upstate New York.
Turn left onto Reeves Road.
And they grow a whole lot of fruits and veggies. There's peppers, strawberries, zucchinis, squash, tomatoes.
Do you think we'll get to ride in a tractor? Very possible. This is it. Excellent. Okay.
Ah, a ride in a tractor. It's the small things. So, this farm is run by 3 brothers, Mark, Andy, and Brian. And their family has been cultivating this land for generations. Mark walked me around the farm, showing me the little seedlings on the back of trucks ready to be planted. He told us what it was like back in the day.
We had apple trees along where these barns are. That's where we made our tree houses, And now it's all changed.
Mark says that one important thing that's changed around his farm is that several years ago, the Reeves family started growing organic food alongside their conventional crops. And Mark says that going organic has meant doing some things a little bit differently.
What is the biggest difference between organic and conventional?
It's a pain in the ass. That's the biggest difference. Doing it the hard way.
Mark says that going organic is doing it the hard way because he's not allowed to use certain synthetic pesticides and fertilizers to grow his organic crop. That's what makes it organic and not conventional. But Mark says that all this extra effort to produce organic food is worth it. Why? Because the industry is booming. In the US last year, it was estimated that we bought more than $37 billion worth of organic food.
What do people tell you about the organic? What do they say?
It feels good, I just feel that it's better for me. And the one that really drives me up the wall is I think it tastes better.
When they say that,
Yeah,
they say
well,
that.
The organic tastes better. Nice. Okay. Whatever,
That's what you tell them?
It doesn't taste any better.
Suffice to say, the Organic Trade Association doesn't use Mark as their spokesperson. But they don't need Mark, because organic has plenty of advocates. People are going absolutely bonkers for organic. And over, surveys are finding that people buy organic food for the same couple of reasons. And those are the things we're going to serve up today. First course, does organic taste better? Second course, is organic more nutritious? Does it have more vitamins in it? Third course, is conventional worse for your health because it has toxic chemicals on it? And for dessert, is organic better for the environment? Now, even our organic farmer, Mark Reeves, finds a lot of this hard to swallow.
Do you think people that buy organic food are suckers?
Jesus, she's harsh, isn't she? No, they're not suckers. They believe different than me, that's all. They got a different point of view. You know, theirs is wrong, but I mean, other than that.
So who's right, Mark or his customers? Because when it comes to our food, there's lots of opinions. But then there's science. An important announcement here. Organic food is a big topic. So today we're focusing on fruits and veggies, not meat. And we're saving genetically modified organisms, which aren't allowed in organic food, for their own episode. Let's start with one of Mark's biggest gripes, that people think organic food tastes better than conventional food. Does it? We know what Mark thinks.
Okay, whatever. It doesn't taste any better.
But hold on there. Mark hasn't done peer-reviewed studies. Lucky for us, researchers at the University of Uppsala in Sweden have. In a series of experiments, they gave people slices of tomatoes, presenting them as organic or conventional. And hey, good news for organic. People were more likely to say that the tomatoes presented as organic were tastier. But Uppsala, here's the catch. Some of those tasty, seemingly organic tomatoes were actually conventional. The researchers at Uppsala University purposefully misled people. Other studies have similarly found that slapping an organic label over food, even if it's not organic, can make people think it tastes better. Generally speaking, though, researchers found that growing a crop organically or conventionally doesn't consistently affect its taste. But Mark did tell us about something that does consistently affect the taste of fruits. Say, strawberries.
I take the Nutella. You know Nutella, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I know Nutella.
I cut the stems off, spear it with a fork, shove it down in a Nutella bottle and swirl it about 4 times.
Conclusion. When you cover something in Nutella, it tastes delicious. You put that hazelnut spread over some pancakes, strawberries, just delightful. But yeah, when it comes to taste, whether it's conventional or organic, doesn't make a difference. Okay, another big reason why people buy organic is because they think it's more nutritious. That is, they think it's packed with more vitamins and minerals than the conventional stuff. But is it? Dr. Catherine Bradbury is a nutritional epidemiologist at Oxford University.
If you review all of the studies, there's really not a lot of difference between organic and conventionally grown fruit and vegetables. You know, there's no difference in vitamin C content and potassium content and magnesium content overall.
Catherine says that while there are many studies looking at whether or not there is more nutrition in organic foods, some studies say yes, others say no. When it comes to science, you have to look at the overall picture. And in 2012, researchers at Stanford did just that. They looked at scores of studies on the nutritional value of organics, analysing vitamin levels in tomatoes, eggplants, carrots, corn, plums, strawberries, peppers, wheat, kale. Yes! Even kale! And? Quote, "We did not find significant differences in the vitamin content of organic and conventional." End quote. And any minor differences that were found wouldn't matter for most people. For example, organic produce tended to have more phosphorus in it, but the authors wrote that would only be important to someone facing near total starvation. So, probably not an issue for most people buying organic? Conclusion. The science is not there to support the claim that organic means it's more nutritious. It's pretty simple. So, you can tick that off your list of reasons to buy organic. Next on that list, fear that conventional produce is covered in toxins that are going to make you sick. Perhaps when you think of an organic farm, you think of a serene farm with fruits and vegetables left to grow as nature intended, free from dangerous chemicals. And perhaps you think that because a lot of advertising is telling you that. Like this gem from the advocacy group Only Organic.
Toxic pesticides can say goodbye. No more toxins in our lives.
And some organic farming techniques actually do fit this song and dance. Well, not exactly this song and dance, but the Reeves brothers don't use chemicals in some processes. For example, they say goodbye to weed killer on their organic strawberries. Andy, Reeves brother number 2, told me all about it while he was working the strawberry fields in a tractor.
Andy?
Hello?
Hello.
Ready?
Ready?
Want that off?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Without weed killer on their strawberries, the Reeves brothers use a real old-school approach.
We probably will hand weed the organic strawberries 10 times a season. And
Hand weed.
hand weed 10 times a season.
Do you do the hand weeding personally?
Are you kidding me? No.
Did you ever?
I'm 63 years old. It's hard for me to even say the word.
The Reeves farm doesn't hand weed because they think it's the right thing to do. Organic food regulations actually don't allow farmers to use the potent weed killers that they can on their conventional strawberries. But that doesn't mean the Reeves organic crops are chemical-free. Organic certification does allow farmers to use some synthetic chemicals to kill pests. Because while you can hand weed, you can't hand pick out fungi and bacteria from a crop. So even organic crops sometimes need chemicals. Here's Mark, brother number 1.
So what is this?
All right.
Says
That does it for today.
fungicide, bactericide.
Might be back tonight, might not, but it'll be back tomorrow.
Copper this is organic?
Yes, it is.
Mark handed me a heavy paper bag. Like a lot of pesticides, it had the word danger written across it.
Peligro. Keep out of reach of children. Just gonna stick my hand in it. It's like really fine powder.